Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Settle in wherever you are. Maybe you are watching from bed, maybe from the couch with the lights low, maybe from a desk where you told yourself you would only listen for a few minutes, and then somehow history pulled up a chair beside you. However you found your way here, I want you to get comfortable, because tonight we're going to New York City. But not the New York of glass towers, yellow taxis, bright screens, coffee cups, and people walking too quickly with headphones in. We're going to a much older New York, a smaller New York, a dirtier New York, a New York that still smelled of horses, coal smoke, river mud, spoiled food, damp wood, and too many people living too close together. We are going to the place that 19th century newspapers, reformers, tourists, police officers, preachers, and frightened middle-class readers came to call the most dangerous neighbourhood in America. 5 Points. Now I know that name may already sound familiar to you. Maybe you've heard it because of gangs of New York. Maybe you've seen it in a book about Old Manhattan. Maybe the phrase is sitting somewhere in the back of your mind as one of those grim little labels history attaches to places after enough misery has happened there. 5 Points. It sounds simple, almost harmless, like a street corner where 5 roads happen to meet and someone with no imagination named it exactly what it was. But that is the thing about this neighbourhood. The name is plain and the history beneath it is not. 5 Points was not dangerous because one bad thing happened there. It was not dangerous because a single gang moved in, or because a few criminals frightened honest people, or because the poor, by some natural defect, made their own suffering worse. That is the easy version, the version people like to tell when they wanted to feel safely separate from it. The real story is harder and much more human. 5 Points became dangerous because New York built a neighbourhood on bad ground, filled it with people who had nowhere else to go, ignored the conditions that were forming around them, and then acted shocked when desperation began to organise itself in the streets. That is where we're going tonight. Not to a battlefield, not to a president's office, not to a grand hotel, a marble courthouse, or the polished parlour of some wealthy merchant who could afford to keep the worst parts of the city several blocks away. We're going to a low, crowded section of Lower Manhattan, near what is now the Civic Centre and Chinatown, where the streets once bent into each other around a notorious crossing. Mulberry Street, Anthony Street, later called Worth, Orange Street, later called Baxter, Cross Street, later called Park, Little Water Street, now gone, 5 streets, 5 corners. 5 directions for a person to enter trouble, or flee from it, depending on the hour. And here is what I want you to understand before we step into it. 5 Points was not always supposed to become a warning. Before it was a slum, before it was a newspaper headline, before visitors described its alleys with the same horrified fascination they might use for a shipwreck or a prison riot, the land beneath it was water. Not metaphorically, not in the distant geological sense. Actual water. A pond. A freshwater pond known as the Collect Pond. Fed by springs, once clear enough for New Yorkers to drink from, and pleasant enough for families to visit. In the 1700s, before the neighbourhood existed, people skated there in winter and gathered nearby in summer. It was not yet a symbol of urban failure. It was part of the city's daily life. And that, honestly, is one of the strangest things about 5 Points. The story of America's most infamous neighbourhood begins not with crime, but with fresh water. Think about that for a moment. A place remembered for mud, fever, gangs, overcrowding, and violence began as a pond people depended on. It is the kind of historical detail that feels almost too neat, as if someone writing a novel decided to make the setting symbolic. But cities do this all the time. They bury what they no longer want to see. They cover streams, level hills, fill ponds, rename streets, demolish buildings, and then act as if the past has politely agreed to leave. New York was especially good at this. It was growing fast, and fast-growing cities are not sentimental when something gets in the way. By the late 18th century, the pond that had once provided water was surrounded by industries that needed space and produced waste. Tanneries, slaughterhouses, breweries, workshops. These businesses were pushed north from the older part of town because they smelled bad, made noise and polluted everything around them. The problem was that the thing they polluted was the water source itself. Waste went into the pond. The banks grew foul. The clear water turned into something people feared. By the early 1800s, city leaders had a problem sitting in the middle of valuable land, and the solution they chose was simple. Drain it, fill it, build over it, pretend the pond had never been there. If you are listening from a city tonight, I want you to ask yourself something. What is under your street? Not in the dramatic sense. Not treasure, not bones, not secret tunnels, though sometimes cities have all three. I mean, what was there before the pavement? A creek, a marsh, a field, a burial ground, a path, a poor neighbourhood cleared for something cleaner looking. Most of us walk over these places every day without knowing it. We trust the sidewalk, we trust the building. We trust that whatever is underneath has been dealt with properly. But in Lower Manhattan, in the early 19th century, the ground under 5 Points had not been dealt with properly. It had been hidden. The city filled the collect pond with soil, rubbish, and debris. That may sound practical enough, but the land did not simply become solid because officials wished it so. The area remained damp, uneven, and unstable. The buried organic material settled. Water kept finding its way up. Buildings constructed over the old pond and marshy ground sagged and shifted. Cellars flooded. Foundations cracked. Streets grew muddy. Smells rose from below. And into this soft, troublesome land came people who did not have the money to be picky. Poor immigrants, newly free black New Yorkers, labourers, widows, children, families arriving with trunks, bundles, tools, or sometimes almost nothing at all. People who needed a room, any room, close enough to work to survive. This is one of the first hard truths of 5 Points. The neighbourhood did not become crowded because people loved crowding. It became crowded because crowding was what poverty could afford. If you had money in 1820s or 1830s New York, you did not choose a sinking building near foul drainage and noisy streets. You moved somewhere better. You moved north or west, or into a house with more air and less disease. But if you were arriving from Ireland with little more than the clothes you could carry, or if you were a black family trying to build a life in a city that had ended slavery but not racism, or if you were a day labourer paid only when work was available, your choices were narrower. You took the room that was offered. You shared space. You accepted the smell. You told yourself it was temporary, because many people in hard places survive by telling themselves the present is temporary. Before we go further, I just want to say, if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like quiet history that moves slowly through the lives of ordinary people, it would mean the world to me if you hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when you feel it. When something in this story makes you pause, or look at your own street differently, or think about the people who lived before anyone thought to write their names down. And if you want to, tell me where you are listening from tonight. What city, what country, what room, what time it is where you are. I always like knowing where these stories travel after they leave me. There is something quietly strange about talking about old New York while someone is listening in a bedroom in Warsaw, or a kitchen in Ohio, or a bus somewhere after midnight. History does that. It moves through walls better than people do. Now dim the lights a little if you can. Let whatever is around you settle. We're going back to Manhattan in the first half of the 19th century, when the city was changing so quickly that even people living inside it could barely keep up. The population was climbing, ships were arriving, work was expanding and failing and expanding again. New York was becoming America's great port, a place where goods, money, disease, rumours and human beings arrived constantly. The city promised opportunity, and in some ways that promise was real. There was work on the docks, work in shops, work in kitchens, laundries, factories, stables, cellars, construction sites and streets. But work did not mean security. A man might earn wages one week and nothing the next. A woman might take in washing until her hands cracked and still not make enough to move her children into a better room. A child might sell matches, sweep crossings, run errands, pick through refuse, or sleep in a hallway because the family's rented space was too crowded for everyone to lie down at once. That is the city around 5 Points. Not a city of easy villains, a city of pressure. And pressure, left long enough, changes people. It changes buildings. It changes streets. It changes what children think is normal. In 5 Points, privacy disappeared first, then cleanliness, then safety. Then the ordinary assumption that someone outside your door was more likely to help you than harm you. Imagine a building meant for one family, then divided into rooms, then subdivided again, then filled past any reasonable limit. Imagine damp walls, broken stairs, shared privies, water that had to be carried, laundry hanging in air that never really dried, cooking smells mixing with sewage smells, strangers moving in and out, babies crying, adults coughing, arguments travelling through thin partitions because walls in poor housing have never been very good at keeping misery private. Now imagine the street outside is not a peaceful escape from that room. It is another room, larger and more dangerous, where everybody has to negotiate space with everybody else. This is where the reputation begins. Not with a knife in an alley, although there were knives. Not with a gang fight, although there were fights. It begins with density. Too many people, too little money, too little sanitation, too little police protection that could be trusted, too much alcohol sold cheaply, too many landlords making money from decay, too many reformers visiting only long enough to be shocked. Too many newspapers discovering that horror sold well if it could be printed with enough detail. 5 Points became famous for danger, partly because danger was there, and partly because the rest of the city needed a place to put its fears. Every growing city has a place like that. A district people point toward and say, "There, that is where the trouble lives." It is comforting in a way, because if trouble lives there, then perhaps it does not live here. But trouble in 5 Points was never that neatly contained. The neighbourhood was tied to the whole city. Its workers served the wealthier homes. Its voters mattered to political machines. Its saloons fed money into broader networks. Its gangs did not exist outside politics, but often inside it, attached to elections, fire companies, patronage, and street power. Its poverty was not separate from New York's wealth. It was one of the conditions that helped wealth function. This is the part that gets lost when 5 Points is remembered only as a den of criminals. The city needed cheap labour, but it did not want to look too closely at where that labour slept. It needed immigrants, but feared them. It needed poor women's work, but judged poor women's survival. It needed neighbourhoods like 5 Points, and then punished them for existing. Let us picture the place carefully, before the worst of its legend hardens. It is not night yet. It is late afternoon, maybe in the 1840s, and the streets are still busy. The road surface is uneven. In wet weather it holds mud, and in dry weather it throws dust. Pigs may still be rooting nearby. Children run without the sort of supervision modern parents would expect, because adults are working and rooms are crowded and the street, dangerous as it is also where life happens. Women carry buckets, baskets, bundles of laundry. Men stand outside saloons waiting for news of work or argument or both. A cart wheels past slowly. Someone is shouting from an upper window. Somewhere close by a fiddle starts, or a dance step taps against a wooden floor, because 5 Points, for all its misery, was never only misery. That is important. People sang there. They danced there. They married, cooked, prayed, mourned, laughed, borrowed, lent, lied, helped, stole, and endured there. A neighbourhood can be dangerous and still be home. In fact, that is often what makes its danger so hard to understand from the outside. Here is something that genuinely matters as we move through this story. The people who wrote the loudest descriptions of 5 Points were usually not the people who lived there. They were visitors, journalists, missionaries, reformers, police officials, middle-class observers who entered the district with guides, stared at its poverty and left with stories. Some were trying to help, some were trying to sell papers, some were doing both. They described cellars packed with families, dance halls where black and Irish traditions mixed, drunkenness, theft, prostitution, children without shoes, men with scarred faces, women carrying burdens they did not have the language to explain. Those accounts are valuable, but they are not innocent. They often turned real suffering into spectacle. They made 5 Points useful as a warning about immigration, race, alcohol, Catholicism, urban growth, political corruption, or whatever the writer already feared before he arrived. And yet the ground itself confirms that 5 Points was not invented out of nothing. Archaeologists working in the late 20th century recovered an enormous number of artefacts from the neighbourhood, evidence of households, sanitation features, ordinary objects, and the daily lives of people usually reduced to stereotypes. That is one of the most moving things about archaeology in a place like this. It does not only find grand things, it finds broken plates. Clay pipes, bottle glass, buttons, combs, toys, scraps of meals, the small material proof that people were not legends, not types, not warnings in somebody else's newspaper column. They were residents. They owned things. They lost things. They repaired things. They threw things away. They lived one day and then the next, which is what most human beings in history have done. So when we ask how 5 Points became America's most dangerous neighbourhood, we have to be careful with the question. Dangerous for whom? Dangerous in what way? For middle-class visitors, the danger was often imagined as moral contamination, the fear that poverty might spread, that immigrants might change the city, that racial mixing might disturb the order people wanted to believe was natural. For residents, danger could be much more direct. Disease, fire, hunger, violence, eviction, exploitation, a landlord who would not repair a building, a saloon keeper who extended credit until wages disappeared, a political boss who offered protection and demanded loyalty, a gang member at the corner, a police officer who might help you, ignore you, or treat you as the problem. These were not all the same danger, but they met in the same streets. The story we are beginning tonight is not a clean descent from innocence into evil. It is a story of bad decisions, bad land, rapid growth, mass immigration, racial tension, cheap housing, political corruption, and ordinary people trying to survive inside conditions they did not create. There will be gangs in this story, yes. There will be saloons, riots, police raids, notorious houses, and street corners where a person walked more carefully after dark. But before we get to that, we have to start with the pond, because long before 5 Points became a name, people whispered with disgust or excitement. The city made a choice. It took polluted water, covered it with dirt, and sold the surface as if the trouble underneath had been solved. And that is where the neighbourhood begins. Not with the first gang, not with the first crime report, not with the first frightened tourist peering into a cellar doorway. It begins with a landscape that would not stay buried. A pond turned dump. A dump turned building ground. Building ground turned cheap housing. Cheap housing turned crowding. Crowding turned disease and desperation. And desperation, once packed tightly enough, finds systems of its own. So let us walk there slowly. The year is not fixed yet. It could be 1825, or 1835, or 1845, because the neighbourhood changed. But some things stayed familiar. The air is damp. The streets are narrow. The old pond is gone from sight, but water still gathers where it should not. A child steps around a puddle that smells wrong. A woman lifts her skirt hem out of the mud. A man coming off the docks turns into Orange Street looking for a room he can afford. Above him, laundry hangs from a line. Below him, beneath the street, beneath the cellar stones, beneath the foundations already beginning to complain, the old Collect Pond is still part of the story. The city has covered it, but it has not escaped it. And as the evening thickens over lower Manhattan, more people are arriving at the 5 Points carrying hunger, hope, exhaustion, and the small private belief that tomorrow might be better if they can just get through tonight. Before there were gangs at 5 Points, before there were dance halls, police raids, cellar rooms, newspapers full of warnings, and visitors walking through the neighbourhood with that particular mixture of fear and excitement people bring when they believe they are looking at the worst place in a city, there was water. That is the first thing to keep in mind. Not filth, not crime, not the dark stairways and overcrowded rooms that would later make the district famous. Water. Clear enough once that people drank from it. Wide enough that it shaped roads around itself. Deep enough that a person standing on its shore would not think of it as a puddle or a marsh, but as a real lake held inside the lower half of Manhattan. The Collect Pond sat in a natural basin north of the old settled town, roughly where today the courthouses, government buildings and crowded streets of lower Manhattan press against each other. In the 1700s it was still outside the densest part of the city, close enough to matter, but far enough that a person could go there and feel the town loosen around them. There were hills near it then, actual hills, not the flattened, graded, surveyed surface we know now. Bayard's Mount rose nearby, one of the highest points in lower Manhattan. A stream ran out toward the Hudson through marshland. Another carried water toward the East River. The pond gathered the life of the island quietly, and for a long time New Yorkers treated it as something useful, ordinary and dependable. It is hard to picture this now because modern lower Manhattan gives almost no help to the imagination. The streets are hard, vertical, impatient. Buildings rise where slopes once stood. People cross Center Street or Worth Street thinking about appointments, court dates, deliveries, lunch breaks, subway entrances, or nothing at all. The ground does not announce what it used to be, but if you strip away the pavement, the municipal buildings, the traffic, the old jail walls that once stood near there, the tenements that came before them, the fill dirt beneath those tenements, and the layers of trash and brick and broken household objects compacted over time, you eventually arrive at a wet place. That is where this story begins, under the surface, with a pond that New York used until New York ruined it. In the early colonial period, the Collect was one of the city's great advantages. Fresh water was not a decorative amenity. It was survival infrastructure. People needed it for drinking, cooking, brewing, washing, animals, gardens and trade. Wells existed, but wells could fail, foul, dry or taste bad. A spring-fed pond mattered. It was a storehouse. It was a landmark. It supplied fish. It gave the city a boundary and a gathering place. In winter, when the surface froze, people skated there. In warmer months, families could walk along the shore, and for a while there was nothing strange in imagining the place as part of a decent city's future. If New York had been slower, if land values had not sharpened every decision, if officials had valued open space differently, the Collect might have become a park, a preserved water feature, a public breathing place around which the city could grow. That idea was not impossible. People proposed versions of it, but growing cities are often very poor judges of their own future. They mistake available land for wasted land. They mistake water for an obstacle. And once money begins looking at a pond, the pond is already in danger. The trouble came slowly enough that, at first, it could probably be ignored. That is how many urban disasters begin. Not with one dramatic mistake, but with a long series of practical choices made by people who can explain each choice perfectly well in the moment. The noisiest, dirtiest, most unpleasant businesses needed to be somewhere. Tanneries needed water for processing hides. Slaughterhouses needed space away from refined noses. Breweries, potteries, workshops and other trades required water, fuel, disposal, labour and room. No respectable family with money wanted these activities directly beside them if they could avoid it, so they edged toward the pond and the less settled ground around it. A tannery by itself did not create 5 points. A slaughterhouse by itself did not doom the neighbourhood. A brewery on the edge of town was not by itself an apocalypse. But each one took something from the water and returned something worse. Hair, blood, lime, refuse, chemicals, scraps, wash water, animal waste, and the everyday runoff of a city that did not yet understand sanitation as a system. The pond received all of it because water has always been expected to carry away what people do not want to look at. There is something almost painfully familiar in that. A place is considered useful, so it is exploited. Then it becomes polluted because of the exploitation. Then the pollution is used as proof that the place has no value. By the late 18th century, the Collect Pond had changed from an asset into a civic embarrassment. New Yorkers complained about the smell. They worried about disease. They could see that the water was no longer what it had been. And yet the industries that helped poison it were not accidents. They were part of the city's growth. They supplied goods people used. They supported livelihoods. They helped make money. The pond was not destroyed by monsters. It was destroyed by ordinary economic logic, repeated day after day until the result was undeniable. Imagine standing near it in that period, before the decision to bury it had fully taken hold. The surface may still catch the sky in places, but the banks are no longer clean. The smell comes first, heavy in warm weather. Not a single smell, but a layered one. Wet mud, rotting vegetation, tannery waste, animal remains, smoke from nearby workshops, standing water where insects breed. A cart passes with a load meant for one of the businesses nearby. Men work with sleeves rolled, not thinking of themselves as historical actors creating the conditions for a notorious slum. They are earning wages. They are hauling, cutting, curing, scraping, boiling, dumping, loading. Somewhere nearby, a child is sent on an errand and steps around a patch of ground that sucks at the shoe. A dog noses at refuse. A woman covers her mouth against the stink and keeps walking because the city does not stop for unpleasant air. This is not yet 5 points, but the ingredients are gathering. City leaders had options, at least in theory. They could have cleaned the pond. They could have protected it more aggressively. They could have made the surrounding land a public space. They could have treated fresh water as something worth defending rather than something to be used until spoiled. But in the early 1800s, the decision that gathered the most force was to drain and fill it. There is a brutal simplicity to that solution. If the pond smells, remove the pond. If the water is polluted, cover the water. If the land is low, raise it with whatever material can be found. Soil, debris, rubbish, construction waste, organic matter, anything that can make a surface where a surface is desired. That is how cities have often dealt with their mistakes. They do not solve them so much as make them horizontal and buildable. The draining began with engineering ambition and ended with a street name almost everyone knows without knowing why. A canal was cut to carry water away toward the Hudson, and in time that canal was covered over. Canal Street, which today feels like one of those names that has simply always existed, began with this practical act of trying to move unwanted water out of the city's way. The pond itself was filled by 1811. On paper, this looked like progress. A foul body of water had been eliminated. Land had been created. Lots could be sold. Streets could be mapped. Houses could be built. A city growing northward had swallowed an obstacle and converted it into real estate. That was the official story, or at least the useful one. But anyone who has ever dealt with water knows water is not impressed by paperwork. You can rename a place. You can survey it. You can divide it into lots and sell those lots to people with clean handwriting and good coats. You can cart in soil and flatten the surface, but if the land underneath is a basin, if it has held water for centuries, If organic matter has been buried under fill, if drainage is poor and the work has been done cheaply or too quickly, then the ground remembers. It shifts, it settles, it releases smells, it stays damp in places where solid ground should not be damp. Cellars take water, foundations lose confidence, roads grow soft after rain. The buried pond does not return as a lake, but it returns as conditions. This is the detail that matters more than almost any single crime story ever told about 5 Points. The neighbourhood was born with a physical defect. Not a small inconvenience, not merely unpleasant scenery, but a structural disadvantage built directly into the ground. When middle-class houses first appeared on the filled land, there was optimism around the area. Why not? It was close to the city. It was newly available. It had the promise of improvement. Developers and buyers did what people have always done when land appears suddenly profitable. They imagined the future they wanted and discounted the warnings that made that future less attractive. For a while, respectable residents lived there. The decline was not instant. History rarely offers that kind of neatness, but the dampness remained. The settling continued. Cellars flooded. Mosquitoes bred. The smell of buried organic material and bad drainage became hard to ignore. Houses that had seemed like investments began to look like mistakes. Now, I want you to sit with the emotional part of that for a moment, because it is easy to describe this as urban development, landfill, drainage, and environmental failure, and all of that is true. But imagine being a family that bought or rented into the promise. You come to a new house or a new street with some hope. Maybe it is not grand, but it is better than where you were. The street has a name, the rooms are real, the city is expanding, and perhaps you believe you have placed yourself in the path of that expansion. Then the damp begins to show itself. A cellar that should store food becomes unreliable. A wall sweats. A smell rises in summer. The unpaved street outside turns into deep mud after rain. Not clean country mud, but city mud mixed with animal waste, kitchen refuse, ash, and whatever else people have thrown where there was nowhere better to put it. Your house shifts slightly. Doors do not close as they should. The neighbourhood begins to acquire a reputation. People with more money leave first because people with more money usually can. Their departure lowers the standing of the place, and the lowering of standing changes who is willing or forced to move in next. That is one of the quiet mechanisms of urban poverty. Decline does not simply happen inside buildings. It happens through reputation, through lending, through rent, through what landlords decide is worth repairing, through who has the freedom to move away and who does not. Once the better-off residents left the filled land around the old collect pond, property owners did not necessarily abandon the houses. They found new tenants, poorer tenants, tenants willing to accept worse conditions because the rent was lower, because the location was close to work, because the city offered no gentle alternatives. A damp room is not attractive until it is the only room within reach. A sagging building is not acceptable until the choice is between that and no building at all. The old pond did not create poverty, but it helped make a landscape where poverty could be housed cheaply, densely, and profitably. Here is where the story begins to turn toward the 5 Points people later claimed to know. The bad ground attracted bad housing, or more precisely, it attracted housing that could be neglected because the people living in it had little power to demand better. The land's reputation lowered its value. Lower value made it available to those excluded from better places. Overcrowding increased returns for landlords. Houses were subdivided. Rooms were rented by families, boarders, lodgers, workers passing through, widows trying to survive, immigrants arriving with no cushion, and people whose legal freedom did not protect them from social exclusion. As each layer of pressure settled onto the neighbourhood, the physical dampness of the old pond combined with the social dampness of abandonment. That may sound like a harsh phrase, but it is accurate. Cities abandon places long before they officially condemn them. They abandon them by letting drains fail, by tolerating overcrowding, by looking away from landlords, by treating certain residents as if they naturally belong in filth. The buried pond also shaped the streets. This is something people often miss when they think about dangerous neighbourhoods only in terms of human behaviour. Streets are not neutral. Their angles, widths, curves, sightlines and crossings affect how people move, gather, hide, watch, flee, sell, drink, fight, and police one another. Mulberry Street curved because older routes had bent around the pond and its surrounding wetlands. The famous 5 Points intersection emerged from a street pattern shaped by the landscape before it was buried. The result was not a clean grid with easy surveillance and open movement, but a tight, irregular place where corners met awkwardly and small spaces took on outsized importance. Paradise Square, that open triangular space near the intersection, would later become one of the symbolic centres of the district. It was not paradise in the way the name suggests. Names in poor neighbourhoods often have a grim sense of humour, whether anyone intends it or not. If you were walking there in the 1820s, before the worst immigrant overcrowding of the famine years, you would already sense the neighbourhood's instability. The filled land had not produced a stable middle-class enclave. The streets could be foul, drainage was poor, buildings aged badly. The people moving in were increasingly those pushed by limited choices, but had not yet become the fully developed legend that outsiders would later consume. This is important because it reminds us that 5 Points was made over time. The dangerous neighbourhood did not appear fully formed. It accumulated. Each year added something. A new wave of arrivals, a neglected building, a cellar turned into lodging, a tavern that became a gathering point, a landlord who discovered that repair was optional if tenants were desperate enough, a reformer who wrote about the horrors but not always about the systems behind them, a newspaper that found the name useful, a police force still learning how to control a city whose growth had outpaced its institutions. The Collect Pond was gone from maps as water, but not from bodies. Bad drainage meant damp housing, and damp housing meant sickness. In the 19th century, before germ theory was widely accepted and before modern sanitation reshaped urban life, people understood disease imperfectly, but they noticed patterns. Low, wet, crowded districts suffered. Fever found the poor first and moved through them quickly. Cholera outbreaks in New York exposed the city's inequalities with terrible clarity. The disease did not care about morality, though newspapers and respectable observers often spoke as if it did. They liked to say illness raged in haunts of vice, as though people were sick because they were sinful rather than because they were packed into filthy rooms with bad water, poor drainage, hunger, and exhaustion. 5 Points became, in the public imagination, not just unhealthy, but morally diseased. That confusion between physical conditions and moral judgment would haunt the neighbourhood for decades. This is one of the most important ideas in the whole story. Once a poor place becomes associated with disease, outsiders often decide the people are the infection. The actual causes become secondary. Drainage, wages, rent, discrimination, infrastructure, and public neglect are complicated. Blaming residents is simple. 5 Points was described again and again, as if danger came naturally out of the people living there. But before those people arrived in large numbers, the city had already damaged the land, filled it poorly, and allowed bad housing to grow on top of it. The pond beneath the pavement was not a metaphor to them. It was water in the cellar, rot in the timbers, insects in the air, mud in the street, and fever in the room. Imagine a tenant waking after rain. The room is close and smells of damp clothing. Someone has coughed through the night. A child steps from a straw mattress onto a floor that feels cold even in mild weather. Downstairs, the cellar has taken water again. Not enough to be a dramatic flood, perhaps, just enough to sour everything stored there, enough to make the air heavy. Outside, the street has become a mixture of mud and refuse. A cartwheel sinks. A man curses. A woman lifts a bucket and makes her way around the worst patch, because there is no choice but to go out. Work does not wait for dry ground. Hunger does not care whether drainage is adequate. The landlord may know about the water. Of course he knows. Everyone knows. But repair costs money, and tenants who can leave have already left. Now, think about the old pond again. It did not vanish. It became rent. It became low property values. It became a reason a desperate person could afford a space. It became a reason a landlord could justify neglect. It became the difference between a neighbourhood that might have remained respectable and one that city officials, writers and tourists would later treat as a warning. The physical environment did not force every later event, but it set the terms. Bad ground made cheap housing more likely. Cheap housing drew the poor. The poor drew judgment. Judgment reduced investment. Reduced investment worsened conditions. Worse conditions deepened poverty. Poverty increased the likelihood of informal economies, street power, saloons, gangs, and political dependency. By the time outsiders pointed at 5 points and asked how people could live like that, the answer had been forming under their feet for decades. There is a particular cruelty in the way the city profited from each stage. First, the pond served the city as water. Then nearby industries used it as a convenient waste sink. Then officials turned its polluted remains into land. Then property owners converted that land into rents. Then newspapers converted the suffering on that land into stories. Then reformers converted the stories into campaigns, some sincere, some self-serving. And through it all, the people with the least power were treated as the most visible problem. That is why the pond matters. It shows the sequence. 5 points did not become dangerous because the poor arrived and ruined a good place. The place had already been compromised, and the poor were brought into that compromise because poverty always gets assigned to the least desirable ground. The old collect also gives us a way to understand New York itself. The city has always been a machine for transformation. Shorelines become docks, hills become fill, streams become sewers, neighbourhoods become investment opportunities, then slums, then redevelopment zones, then respectable addresses again. The speed of that transformation can make the past feel disposable, but beneath that speed are consequences. In 5 points, the consequence was a neighbourhood whose residents inherited an environmental failure and then were blamed for the life that grew inside it. A pond was polluted, buried, sold, built upon, neglected, overcrowded, sensationalised, and finally erased beneath courthouses, parks, and renamed streets. That is a long chain, and every link matters. By the time large numbers of Irish immigrants began arriving in the 1840s, especially those fleeing famine, the neighbourhood was ready to receive them in the worst possible way. That sentence sounds almost cold, but it is historically necessary. 5 points had cheap rooms because the better off had left. It had landlords willing to subdivide space. It had a reputation that kept respectable investment away. It had streets and buildings already marked by decay. It had proximity to work, which mattered enormously to people living day to day. It had churches, saloons, informal networks, and enough density that a newcomer might find someone from the same county, the same language world, the same kind of hunger. For a person arriving with almost nothing, a bad neighbourhood could still be a foothold. That is another truth worth holding carefully. 5 points was dangerous, but it was also an entry point. It received people the rest of the city did not want to receive cleanly. The pond beneath the pavement made that entry point unstable from the beginning. A family might arrive hoping to stay only briefly, to earn enough to move. Many did move when they could. Others became trapped by wages, illness, discrimination, debt, widowhood, or children too young to work and too hungry not to eat. The neighbourhood kept absorbing them. The rooms filled, the cellars filled, the streets filled. The old water table did its quiet work below. Above it, a new social world formed. one that outsiders would soon describe in dramatic language, because dramatic language was easier than responsibility. There is a moment in any city's history when a place changes from being merely poor to being notorious. 5 Points crossed that line because its conditions were extreme, but also because its location made it visible. It was not hidden miles away from power. It sat in lower Manhattan, uncomfortably close to City Hall, courts, commerce, and respectable neighbourhoods. The city's leaders did not have the luxury of pretending it existed somewhere else. A person could move from government buildings to slum streets in a short walk. That closeness made 5 Points useful as a spectacle and disturbing as a fact. It was near enough to frighten people who did not live there, and far enough socially that they could imagine its residents as another class of human being altogether. This is where we should leave the ground for a moment and listen to the street beginning above it. Not the fully developed roar of the later 5 Points, not yet the complete sound of saloons, fights, fiddles, political crowds, and fire companies racing each other through narrow streets, but the earlier sound of a neighbourhood losing its first promise. Rainwater in ruts, wagons over boards, workmen returning, women calling to children, doors opening into rooms that are smaller than need requires, a landlord's agent counting rent, a family deciding whether the smell is tolerable because there is no money for another place, a newcomer asking where a bed might be found, someone pointing toward the old filled land because there is always space there if you can pay, and sometimes even if you cannot pay much. Under all of it, the buried collect remains part of the arrangement. It is not visible, and that is exactly why it matters. Visible disasters can be named. Invisible ones become normal. A pond covered by dirt becomes a neighbourhood problem. A neighbourhood problem becomes a moral problem. A moral problem becomes a police problem. A police problem becomes a legend. By the time people are arguing about gangs and vice, they have forgotten the water. But the water was there first. It shaped the land, attracted industry, absorbed pollution, invited a bad engineering solution, undermined the buildings, lowered the value, and helped create the conditions into which the city's poorest residents would be crowded. So when we step next into the human life of 5 Points, when we begin to see who arrived, who stayed, who was pushed in by hunger and pushed out of everywhere else by prejudice, we should carry the pond with us. It is easy to blame a crowded room for the smell inside it. It is harder to ask who built the room over a dump, who rented it without repair, who profited from every body packed into it, and who then stood at a safe distance describing the tenants as if they were the source of the rot. The old Collect Pond teaches that 5 Points was never just a neighbourhood. It was an accumulation of decisions, and the first of those decisions was to take a damaged place, cover it quickly, and let the people with the fewest choices live on top. The people came next, but not because the city opened its arms and invited them in with any real kindness. That is the part that needs to be said plainly. 5 Points did not fill because thousands of families looked at muddy streets, rotting houses, flooded cellars, bad smells, and public contempt, and decided that this was their dream. It filled because people were pushed toward the places that better-off New Yorkers had already decided were beneath them. The old pond had been buried, the ground had softened and settled, the first promise of the neighbourhood had begun to fail, and once the houses lost respectability, the city found a new use for them. They could hold the poor, not comfortably, not safely, not permanently, at least not in the hopeful version people told themselves when they arrived. But they could hold them. They could hold one family in a room meant for one person. They could hold boarders on floors, children under stairs, widows in corners, labourers in cellars, and new arrivals who had not yet learned that in New York, the first room you could afford was often the room someone else had escaped from. This is one of the sharpest truths in the history of the neighbourhood. The poor were not simply living in mud. They were placed there by wages, rents, prejudice, bad infrastructure, and the quiet decisions of people who never had to sleep in the buildings they owned. Let us step into the city around the 1830s and 1840s, before 5 Points had fully become the legend that later writers would sell to readers, but after the basic machinery of poverty was already working. New York was growing so quickly that the old city seemed to be shedding its skin every few years. Ships arrived constantly. Streets filled with carts, labourers, merchants, hawkers, sailors, porters, servants, washerwomen, apprentices, and children running errands too small to be called work, but too necessary to be called play. The docks needed backs. The houses of the comfortable needed hands. The streets needed sweepers, haulers, diggers, carters, and men who could lift heavy things until their bodies failed. There was work, yes, but work is not the same as security. Work could be seasonal, irregular, dangerous, poorly paid, and gone without warning. A man might stand in the morning hoping to be chosen for day labour and return at dusk with nothing. A woman might wash other people's linen until her fingers split, then still owe rent. A child might sell matches or newspapers, carry parcels, shine boots, fetch water, mind a baby, or pick through refuse and learn very young that the city had no soft place waiting for the poor. For many families, 5 Points was not the bottom of a moral fall. It was the bottom of a rent calculation. A better room cost more, a cleaner street cost more, a place with more light, more air, and fewer people cost more. If your wages were uncertain, the city sorted you with a precision that could feel almost personal. You went where the price allowed you to go, and what the price allowed, in Lower Manhattan, was often a room in a decaying building on bad land near the old Collect Pond. This is how a neighbourhood changes, not only through dramatic events, but through the daily arithmetic of need. A landlord sees a house declining and decides not to restore it for one family, because there is more money in cutting it into pieces. A room that once held a parlour becomes a rented space. A hallway becomes storage or sleeping room. A cellar, damp and barely fit for goods, becomes shelter for human beings because someone desperate enough will pay something for it. A shed becomes a rear dwelling. A yard fills with another structure. The air between buildings narrows. Sunlight disappears from lower rooms. The privy serves too many people. Water must be carried from too far away. Refuse gathers because removal costs money, and nobody with power is in a hurry. Soon the building is no longer a house that has become crowded. It is a crowd that happens to have walls around it. The earliest poor communities around 5 Points included free black New Yorkers, and that matters deeply because their presence is often pushed aside when the neighbourhood is remembered only through Irish gangs and later sensational stories. New York ended slavery gradually, with final emancipation in 1827, but freedom did not mean equal welcome. Black New Yorkers faced discrimination in jobs, housing, voting rights, education, public space, and personal safety. They lived in a city that could use their labour while refusing their full belonging. Some had family histories in the city going back generations. Others came from elsewhere, including those escaping slavery or seeking protection in networks of abolitionists, churches, and mutual aid. Around 5 Points and the surrounding lower Manhattan streets were institutions, homes, churches, and organising spaces connected to black life and anti-slavery work. This means that the neighbourhood was not merely a slum in the way outsiders later described it. It was also, for some people, a refuge. That is not a contradiction. A place can be unsafe and still offer safety from something worse. A place can be poor and still hold community. A place can be described by strangers as degraded and still contain courage, skill, tenderness, and organisation invisible to those strangers because they arrived only to be horrified. Picture a black family in the 1830s living near those crowded streets. Their room is small, their work is hard, the neighbourhood is damp and loud, and the city around them does not treat them gently. But nearby there may be a church where news is exchanged, a mutual aid society, an abolitionist meeting, someone who knows someone who can help a fugitive, a woman who can watch a child while another goes to work, a neighbour who understands the particular danger of being black in a city that has changed its laws faster than its habits. That community does not erase the hardship. It helps explain how people survived it, and it also helps explain why later racial tension in the neighbourhood became so bitter. Poverty does not automatically create solidarity. Sometimes it creates proximity without power, competition without fairness, and anger that gets aimed sideways because aiming it upward feels impossible. Then came the Irish in larger and larger numbers. Irish people had been in New York long before the Great Famine, but the famine years changed the scale and urgency of arrival. Beginning in 1845, potato blight devastated Ireland's food supply, and the disaster unfolded inside a political and economic system that left millions vulnerable. People starved. Families were evicted. Disease followed hunger. Ships crossed the Atlantic carrying people who were not merely seeking opportunity in the cheerful immigrant story sense, but fleeing collapse. Many arrived in New York exhausted, grieving, sick, poor, and carrying very little beyond the memory of the place they had left and the hope that America would not kill them as Ireland had seemed to. It is important not to flatten them into one image. Not every Irish immigrant was destitute forever. Not everyone stayed in 5 Points. Many worked, saved, moved, built businesses, joined churches, formed families, and climbed into more stable lives with a stubbornness that deserves respect. But the first landing could be brutal, and for the poorest among them, 5 Points was often one of the few places where a room might be found quickly and cheaply. Think about arriving at the port. The ship has been crowded. The crossing has been frightening. You may have lost someone at sea or left someone behind whom you will never see again. You enter a city that speaks English, yes, but not necessarily your English. It has signs, prices, rules, scams, employers, dockside runners, boarding house keepers, labour agents, and thieves who all seem to understand the city better than you do. You need work. You need lodging. You need food. You need to know which streets are safe, which promises are lies, which countrymen can be trusted, which church might help, where wages are paid, and how to avoid spending everything before you understand what anything costs. A bad room in 5 Points may not look like hope to a visitor, but to someone who has just crossed the Atlantic with nothing, it can be the first fixed point in a terrifying new world. A door, a mattress, a shared stove, someone from the same county sleeping 2 rooms over, a priest nearby, a cousin's cousin who knows a man hiring labourers. The mud is real, but so is the foothold. Germans arrived too, along with English, Welsh, later Italians, and others who entered the same machinery of cheap housing and street survival. The neighbourhood became one of those places where languages crossed in the air, and people learned enough of each other's words to bargain, fight, flirt, borrow, warn, and insult. It is tempting to call this a melting pot because that is the phrase American history likes to use when it wants hardship to sound productive. But 5 Points was not a neat melting pot. It was more like a crowded pot left too long over uneven heat. Cultures mixed there, yes. Mixed. Music, dance, food, slang, politics, labour networks, street customs and survival strategies rubbed against one another until new forms emerged. But mixing under pressure is not the same as harmony. Black residents and Irish immigrants lived near each other, worked near each other, sometimes socialised, sometimes married, sometimes made music and dance in the same spaces, and sometimes competed fiercely for the lowest paid work in a city that kept both groups near the bottom. Employers could use that competition. Politicians could use it. Nativists could use it. Newspapers could exaggerate it. The result was a neighbourhood with remarkable cultural exchange and real social tension happening at the same time. That is hard to hold in one thought, but history often requires exactly that. The poor were not pushed into the mud as one single people. They were pushed in as groups carrying different histories, different wounds, different religions, different colours, and different claims on belonging. The city then watched their closeness with suspicion, especially when it crossed lines respectable society wanted kept firm. An Irish Catholic man and a black woman in the same dance hall could become, in the mind of a reform writer, evidence of moral collapse. Children of different backgrounds playing in the same filthy street could be seen not as children adapting to the only world they had, but as proof that the neighbourhood threatened social order. The outside gaze mattered because it shaped policy, policing, charity, and public memory. 5 Points became a screen on which New Yorkers projected anxieties about immigration, race, Catholicism, poverty, alcohol, sex, crime, disease, and urban democracy. The residents lived ordinary days inside what outsiders turned into a symbol. Let us go inside one of those ordinary days, because broad categories can become too clean. Morning comes early in a crowded building, not because anyone has slept well, but because the room is too full for sleep to last. A baby wakes first, or a man leaving for the docks steps over another body, or a woman rises to start water heating before the shared fire is crowded by other needs. The air is already used up. In winter, breath clouds faintly if the fire has fallen low. In summer, the smell is worse, close and damp, with clothing, bodies, chamber pots, stale food, smoke, and the old wetness of the building all mixing into something the residents may stop noticing, until they leave and come back. There is no private bathroom, there is no quiet kitchen. There may be a shared pump or a nearby source for water, but carrying it costs time and strength. If the family takes in boarders, everyone has to manage modesty by habit rather than space. A curtain may divide a sleeping area. A trunk may hold everything valuable. A child learns which floorboards creak, which adult is dangerous when drunk, which neighbour might share bread, and which corner of the room stays driest when rain gets in. This is not picturesque poverty. It is logistics. Every hour requires negotiation. Who uses the fire? Who gets the basin? Who watches the baby? Who goes for coal or wood? Who can stay home sick? And who must work sick because rent does not become kinder when fever arrives? Disease moved easily through such conditions. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, smallpox, and recurring fevers found crowded neighbourhoods with terrible efficiency. People in the 19th century argued about causes. Some blamed bad air, foul smells, moral behaviour, or divine punishment. They were not entirely wrong to fear bad smells, because bad smells often marked bad sanitation, but they did not yet understand the microbial world in the modern sense. What residents knew was more immediate. A child who had been playing yesterday might be burning with fever today. A neighbour might be carried out. A mother might keep working while ill because stopping would mean hunger. The neighbourhood's reputation for disease then attached itself to the people who suffered from disease, as if sickness had chosen them because they were defective. That was one of the cruelest transformations in 5 Points. Conditions became character. Overcrowding became moral failure. Hunger became laziness. Dirt became identity. The city made poor people live in places where staying clean was almost impossible, then judged them for being dirty. Work shaped everything. Men sought day labour on the docks, construction work, carting, street work, cellar work, factory work, and any job that would pay cash soon. Irish women often went into domestic service, laundry, sewing, boarding house labour, or street vending. Black women faced narrower options and harsher discrimination, often in service, washing, cooking, or taking in labour that wealthier households wanted done but not seen. Children worked early because a child's earnings, however small, could matter. That is a sentence that sounds simple until you imagine the child. Not a symbol, a real child, 8 or 9 years old enough to be useful but still young enough to be frightened by a drunk adult shouting in the stairwell. Selling small goods, carrying messages, sweeping crossings, scavenging, running with other children who know the street better than any schoolroom. In 5 Points, childhood did not disappear, but it was shortened by necessity. Children still played. Of course they did. They chased, shouted, invented games, mocked adults, learned songs, watched fights, danced, stole apples, laughed at things they were not supposed to understand. But the street taught them early that the world had teeth. And here is where we have to be honest about crime without letting crime become the whole explanation. There was theft in 5 points. There was violence. There were gangs forming around neighbourhood identity, fire companies, politics, ethnicity, protection, and profit. There were saloons where wages disappeared, brothels where exploitation and survival tangled in ways outsiders preferred to describe only as vice, gambling rooms, fences for stolen goods, pickpockets, bruisers, and men who discovered that fear could be turned into income. But crime did not descend from the sky. It grew in a world where formal employment failed many people, where police protection was inconsistent and often corrupt, where politics rewarded street muscle, where alcohol offered relief and ruin in the same glass, and where young men with few prospects could earn status by becoming dangerous. A neighbourhood with too few legitimate ladders will develop crooked ones. That does not excuse violence. It explains why violence had somewhere to root. The old brewery became the great symbol of this transformation, partly because it was real, and partly because it was useful to storytellers. Once a brewery, it became an overcrowded tenement on Cross Street, infamous in reform literature and newspaper accounts as a place of astonishing misery. Stories claimed enormous numbers of residents, constant crime, and conditions so bad that the building seemed less like housing than a warning carved in brick. We should be careful with the most dramatic claims. 19th century writers often exaggerated when describing poor districts, and the old brewery became almost too perfect as a symbol of urban degradation. But the reason the symbol worked is that the underlying reality was bad enough to make exaggeration believable. A former industrial building packed with poor tenants, associated with crime, disease and neglect, standing in the middle of a neighbourhood already blamed for everything respectable New York feared. Even if half the stories were embroidered, the fabric underneath was still threadbare. What did it feel like to live in a place other people visited in order to be horrified? That is a question worth staying with. Imagine seeing strangers come through your street, accompanied by guides, policemen, missionaries, or men who know the neighbourhood well enough to sell it as an experience. They stare at your doorway. They look at your children. They ask questions about your room. They write down details about your poverty and take them away to be printed for readers who will feel shocked, saddened, excited, superior or charitable, depending on their temperament. Maybe some help comes from this attention. Missions are founded, reformers raise money, buildings are eventually demolished. Schools and aid societies appear, but attention also turns you into scenery. Your hunger becomes evidence, your laundry becomes atmosphere, your accent becomes comic detail, your suffering becomes another person's evening reading. 5 Points residents were not only poor, they were watched. That kind of watching changes a neighbourhood's place in history. The name begins to do work. 5 Points becomes shorthand. Say it in a parlour uptown and people know what you mean. Danger, vice, Irishness, blackness, dirt, drunkenness, crime, overcrowding. A place where respectable women should not go, respectable men should only visit with purpose, and boys might be ruined by proximity. The name becomes heavier than the streets themselves. Residents have to carry that too. A man looking for work may be judged by his address. A woman seeking service may be marked by where she slept. Children grow up knowing that the rest of the city thinks their home is a joke, a threat, or a pit. This is another way people are pushed into mud, not only physically through bad streets and damp cellars, but socially through reputations so thick it clings to them when they leave the block. And yet, inside all of this, life continued with more complexity than the legend allowed. People formed associations, they attended church, they saved pennies, They sent money back to relatives. They buried their dead with ceremony when they could. They organised politically. They defended one another. They fought one another. They danced. They listened to music in halls where Irish steps and African American movement influenced each other in ways that helped shape American popular culture. They built networks of credit and obligation that could be rough but effective. A saloon was not only a place of drinking, it could be a hiring hall, message centre, political office, refuge and trap all at once. A church was not only a place of worship, it could be welfare office, school, identity marker, and shield against a hostile city. A tenement room was not only a site of misery, it could be the first American home a family ever had. History becomes more honest when we let these things exist together. The poor were pushed into 5 Points by forces larger than themselves, but they did not become passive once they arrived. They made a world in the mud. Not a clean world, not a safe one, not one anyone should romanticize, but a world with rules, loyalties, humour, music, work, violence, faith, exhaustion, and the constant effort to get through one more day without losing the little that remained. By the middle of the 19th century, the old pond had disappeared from sight, and the human flood had replaced it. Irish famine refugees, free black New Yorkers, German immigrants, labourers from elsewhere, women alone, children everywhere, men looking for work, men looking for drink, men looking for someone weaker, reformers looking for souls, politicians looking for votes, landlords looking for rent. The streets held all of them, and the mud, literal and social, deepened. It gathered at hems and boots, in stairways, in reputations, in newspaper columns, in court reports, in the memories of those who left and those who never could. The neighbourhood was becoming what the rest of America would soon claim to fear. But before the gangs and saloons could fully define it, before the newspapers could make it famous as a place of blood and vice, the buildings themselves had to do their part. The next thing to understand is the interior life of 5 Points, the rooms where darkness paid rent, where families slept in shifts, where walls sweated, where landlords counted coins, and where danger did not wait outside in the alley because it had already moved indoors. The rooms came next because once the city had made bad ground profitable, and once the poorest residents had been pushed onto it, the danger of 5 Points stopped being only a matter of streets. It moved indoors. That is easy to miss because the neighbourhood is usually remembered from the outside as a crossing of rough streets, a knot of alleys, a place of shouting, fighting, saloons, police, gangs and bodies moving through mud. But the real pressure of 5 Points did not begin at the corner. It began behind doors. It began in rooms where too many people slept with too little air. It began in stairwells that stayed dark even in daylight. It began in cellars where the floor was damp because the buried pond had never fully stopped being water. It began in houses that had once been built for one kind of life and then cut down, divided, rented and worn out until every spare corner could be turned into money. If the street was the public face of 5 Points, the tenement was its engine. The building collected rent from poverty and gave back almost nothing except shelter, and sometimes not even that in any honest sense. Before we go inside, it helps to remember that the word tenement did not always mean exactly what it would mean later in New York law. In the middle decades of the 19th century, many of these buildings were older houses, converted houses, rear houses, former workshops, stables, lofts, cellars, and improvised dwellings that performed the same basic function. They held multiple families under conditions no one with money would willingly choose. Later reformers would define and regulate tenement houses more precisely, but the poor did not need a legal definition to know what it felt like to live in one. A tenement was a place where privacy was scarce, air was stale, stairs were shared, water was work, walls were thin, and the landlord's interest in your life usually stopped at the rent. The danger was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was simply the slow damage of living in a place that never allowed the body to recover. Imagine entering one of these buildings in the 1840s. You come in from a street already crowded with noise, mud, cartwheels, animals, children, vendors, and men standing in doorways because the rooms behind them are too close to sit in all day. The entrance may not be level. The threshold may be worn down by hundreds of feet and years of damp. Inside, the light drops quickly. The hallway smells of smoke, wet plaster, old food, unwashed clothing, human waste, tobacco, coal, and the particular sourness of too many bodies living without enough ventilation. It is not one family's smell. It is the smell of a building that has become a container for need. The stairs are narrow, perhaps uneven, perhaps dark enough that your hand reaches for the wall before your foot trusts the next step. If the building is crowded, there is always sound. A baby crying, a woman calling to someone on another floor, a cough that has gone on too long, boots above, a chair scraping, an argument muffled by thin boards but not hidden, someone laughing in a way that might become anger if the wrong person answers, someone cooking, someone praying, someone sick, someone trying to sleep though it is still afternoon because work begins before dawn, or because there was no work today, and sleep is one way to spend fewer hours hungry. The rooms themselves were often too small for the lives placed inside them. A family might rent a single room and use it for everything. Sleeping, eating, cooking, washing, mending, nursing the ill, storing tools, keeping clothes, receiving relatives, and sometimes taking in boarders because the rent could not otherwise be paid. Boarders were not an unusual detail. They were part of the economics of survival. A family with a little floor space might rent part of it to a single man, another labourer, a cousin newly arrived, a stranger from the same county, or anyone who could pay a small amount. That extra coin might keep the family housed, but it also turned a crowded room into an even more crowded room. Privacy was not a right inside poverty. It was a luxury rented by the square foot. A curtain, if one existed, could mark a separation between sleeping places. A trunk might hold everything the family feared losing. Bedding might be rolled by day and spread at night. Children learned to dress without space, to sleep through noise, to ignore things adults wished they had not seen, and to understand that home did not always mean quiet. When people talk about overcrowding, the word can become dull because it sounds like a statistic. But overcrowding is not just a number of persons per room. It is the way one person's sickness becomes everyone's sickness. It is the way one person's drunkenness becomes everyone's fear. It is the way one person's smoke, cough, anger, hunger, grief, and exhaustion enter the lungs and nerves of everyone nearby. It is a mother trying to keep an infant alive while a boarder stumbles in late. It is a child lying still because there is nowhere else to move. It is a father ashamed that he cannot afford a better place and angry at the wrong people because shame often searches for the nearest target. It is laundry that never fully dries because there is no sun and too many damp garments. It is the family meal cooked in air already used by 5 other tasks. Overcrowding makes the ordinary work of living take more effort, and that extra effort is paid for with the body. The cellars were worse. In 5 points, the cellar was not merely a place under a building. For many of the very poor, it was housing. A room partly below street level, sometimes with a low ceiling, sometimes with little or no direct light, often damp, cold in winter, foul in summer, and vulnerable to flooding. Remember what lay beneath this neighbourhood. The old collect pond had been filled, but the water table, poor drainage and unstable ground remained part of daily life. A cellar on good ground could still be unpleasant. A cellar on bad ground could be a trap. Water seeped in, floors stayed wet, stored food spoiled, bedding absorbed damp, insects bred. The smell of rot and waste settled low. A person living there did not just lack comfort. They lived in a place where the building itself worked against them, and yet cellars could be rented because someone would pay. That is the brutal fact at the centre of this section. If a space could hold a body, a landlord could often make it hold a tenant. We should be careful not to imagine every landlord as a cartoon villain with a curled lip and a ledger full of cruelty. Some were indifferent rather than openly sadistic. Some had inherited property. Some were themselves not grand men of wealth, but middle figures in a chain of ownership, debt, and collection. But indifference can be as dangerous as cruelty when people are living in your walls. The business model rewarded extraction. Spend as little as possible, divide as much as possible, collect as regularly as possible, repair only when necessary, and necessity was usually defined by the owner, not the tenant. Broken windows might be patched poorly or not at all. Stairs might remain unsafe. Privies might overflow. Roofs might leak. If tenants complained, they could be replaced by others with fewer choices. In a city filling with immigrants and the poor, a bad room rarely stayed empty for long. That gave landlords power, and the power was used quietly, month after month, in the form of neglect. This is why darkness paid rent. Not because darkness was poetic, not because it made the neighbourhood mysterious, but because actual dark rooms produced income. A room without enough light still rented. A cellar without proper air still rented. A rear room that never saw the sun still rented. A hallway corner could become storage. Storage could become sleeping space. Sleeping space could become money. In a better housing market, no one would accept such spaces. In 5 points, acceptance was forced by hunger. A person can refuse a bad room only if another room is available. The poor were often offered not choices but degrees of exposure. You could be exposed to damp, or exposed to cold, or exposed to violence in the street, or exposed to eviction, or exposed to the charity system, or exposed to the humiliation of begging. Compared with no shelter, even a dark room had value. That value was then captured by rent. The old brewery became the most infamous example, and it deserves attention because it shows how easily a building could change from industrial use to human storage once the city's economy made that profitable. Built in the 1790s near the Collect Pond, Coulthard's brewery had once belonged to a very different landscape, one where the edge of town and the pond's water made brewing sensible. By the late 1830s, after financial panic and neighbourhood decline, the building had been converted into a crowded lodging and tenement structure. It stood on Cross Street, close to the heart of 5 Points, and reformers, missionaries, journalists, and later historians turned it into the neighbourhood's great dark symbol. Accounts described it as filthy, overcrowded, dangerous, and nearly lawless. Some stories claimed astonishing numbers of residents, even more than 1,000 people at times, and repeated lurid tales of violence in its passages and cellars. We have to handle those claims carefully. 19th century slum writing often exaggerated, especially when the subject was poor immigrants, black residents, sex work, alcohol and crime. A surviving 1850 census count associated with the building gives a lower but still crowded picture, with hundreds of people living in dozens of apartments rather than the most extreme legends. Still, the reason the legends stuck is that the building was bad enough to carry them. It was not necessary for every story to be true for the old brewery to matter. It mattered because it showed the city what happened when a building designed for production became a container for desperation. Picture a former brewery cut into dwellings. High-ceiling spaces altered to create more floors. Former storage areas converted into rooms. Passages narrow enough to make movement feel like negotiation. Poor families, boarders, sex workers, labourers, children, black and white residents, immigrants, and native-born poor, all existing under one damaged roof while the surrounding city described the building as if it were a monster. But buildings are not monsters by themselves. People make decisions about them. Someone allowed the conversion. Someone collected rent. Someone tolerated the conditions. Someone benefited from the fact that the poorest tenants had nowhere better to go. When reformers finally targeted the old brewery for demolition in the early 1850s, they did so with the language of rescue, and in some ways rescue was needed. The Methodist women associated with the 5 Points mission purchased the site. The building was demolished, and a mission house replaced it. That was a meaningful intervention, but it also reveals how extreme things had become before organised reform could move the city to act. The old brewery had to become a public scandal before it became unacceptable. For the people living inside, it had been unacceptable long before then. The daily labour of women inside these rooms was relentless. The neighbourhood is often remembered through gangs and male violence, but the tenement was held together hour by hour by women doing work that rarely entered the records except when reformers noticed it or when it failed. A woman in a 5 Points room might cook over a small fire or stove if fuel could be afforded, wash clothing for her own family and sometimes for paying customers, nurse a sick child, keep track of rent, manage boarders, mend garments, fetch water, dispose of waste, negotiate with neighbours, and try to keep bedding, food and children separate from the filth around them. Cleanliness in such conditions was not a simple matter of virtue. It was labour. It took water, soap, time, fuel, containers, drainage, and space. The middle class often treated cleanliness as a moral sign, as if a clean room proved good character and a dirty one proved failure. But a woman with no running water, too many people in one room, no proper ventilation, a shared privy, damp walls, and wages barely covering food could work herself to exhaustion and still be judged dirty by someone who had never carried a bucket up those stairs. There is something important there, because the outside world often misunderstood the poor by ignoring the cost of order. Order is expensive. Clean bedding is expensive when laundry costs fuel and time. Fresh air is expensive when windows are few or broken, and rent is tied to every available inch. Privacy is expensive. Quiet is expensive. A child's sleep is expensive if adults must take in boarders. Even morality, as respectable people defined it, could be expensive. It is easier to behave according to middle-class expectations when one has rooms enough to separate men from women, adults from children, sickness from health, work from rest, and strangers from family. In 5 Points, those boundaries were often collapsed by architecture. Then outsiders walked in, saw collapsed boundaries, and called the residents degraded. Fire was another danger. Crowded wooden or aging brick buildings, open flames, cheap stoves, candles, poor repairs, narrow stairs, cluttered rooms, and panicked residents made fire a constant threat in dense neighbourhoods. A small mistake could move quickly. If a lamp tipped, if a stove sparked, if a chimney was unsafe, the danger did not stay politely in one room. It travelled through floorboards, walls, stairwells and roofs, fed by old timber and trapped air. Escape could be difficult. Children, the elderly, the sick, and those sleeping in interior spaces were especially vulnerable. Later housing laws would require fire escapes and better ventilation, but those reforms came because earlier housing had proved deadly. 5 Points existed before many of those protections had real force. Residents lived in buildings where the path out might be as dangerous as the room itself. Disease was more constant than fire, and in many ways more feared because it did not announce itself with smoke. It arrived as a cough, a fever, a child's flushed face, a neighbour's sudden weakness, a body carried out after days of decline. Tuberculosis thrived in crowded, poorly ventilated rooms. Cholera exposed the lethal relationship between water, waste and poverty. Typhus and other fevers moved through packed lodging places. In a neighbourhood where people shared air, bedding, privies, pumps, stairs and walls, illness became part of the building's circulation. Medical understanding was changing during the 19th century, but for much of 5 Points' most notorious period, explanations remained mixed. People spoke of miasma, bad air, filth, intemperance, moral weakness, and providence. What they could observe was that the poor got sick often and died too young. What they often failed to admit was that the poor were housed in conditions that made sickness likely. The room, not just the resident, was diseased. Children inside these buildings learned the geography of danger early. They knew which stairs to avoid when drunk men gathered there. They knew where the floor dipped. They knew which neighbour might give them a crust and which one might strike them for noise. They knew the street because the room was too crowded, but they also knew the room because the street was too risky. Childhood in a tenement did not mean the absence of play. Children always find play even in hard places. They made games from scraps, corners, chalk, bottle pieces, stones, songs, dares, and the endless movement of the street. But their play happened in adult proximity. They saw rent disputes, sickness, childbirth, drinking, sex, death, police, fights, and hunger earlier than children in more protected homes. The tenement taught them that adulthood was not a distant stage, but something pressing against them from every side. A boy could become useful to a gang because he already knew how to run messages through the district, how to watch for police, how to read faces, how to disappear into a hallway. A girl could become responsible for younger children long before anyone thought she was old enough to carry that much worry. The building trained them because the building required it. It is worth looking closely at sound. A respectable home in the 19th century was supposed to control sound. Parlours separated formal voices from kitchen work. Bedrooms allowed sleep, doors closed. Servants moved through backspaces. Noise could be managed by architecture. In a 5 points tenement, sound ignored status. Arguments travelled, coughing travelled, babies travelled through walls by voice before they could walk. A woman's sob, a man's threat, a pot falling, a fiddle from below, a hymn, a curse, a prayer, a landlord's knock, a police officer's boot, all entered other people's lives. This lack of acoustic privacy mattered. It kept nerves on alert. It made secrets difficult. It made shame public. It also created a kind of awareness and interdependence. Neighbours heard when someone was in trouble. They heard when a child was sick. They heard when violence began. Sometimes they intervened. Sometimes they did not because intervention could be dangerous or because everyone was too tired. The same thin walls that exposed people also connected them. That is one reason the tenement cannot be described only as a place of misery. It was also a system of knowledge. People knew one another's business because the building made ignorance impossible. Archaeology helps correct the worst simplifications. When excavators uncovered material from the 5 Points area in the late 20th century, the objects did not show a population of animals in human form, which is how some 19th century writers wanted readers to imagine the residents. They found evidence of households, ceramics, bottles, pipes, buttons, food remains, children's items, religious and cultural traces, the ordinary material world of people making choices inside limits. Some residents owned decorated tableware. Some participated in consumer culture more fully than the slum legend allowed. Some households tried to maintain standards, rituals, and identities even in crowded circumstances. That does not mean conditions were good. It means the people inside them were not reducible to the conditions. A cracked plate in a privy deposit can tell us something a sensational newspaper account cannot. It can tell us that someone served tea, that someone cared about a household object, that someone bought or inherited or saved for a thing that made life feel more orderly. The poor did not stop wanting beauty, respectability, or routine because their buildings were dark. They often wanted those things desperately because darkness made them harder to keep. The tenement also blurred the line between home and work. Tailors worked in rooms, laundresses turned rooms into workplaces, boarders turned domestic space into income. Sex workers used rented rooms because survival and exploitation often occupied the same doorway. Small trades and informal economies ran through buildings. A person might sleep beside the tools of a trade, the laundry of another family, the goods being prepared for street sale, or the evidence of work that could not be spoken about openly. This made the home productive, but it also meant rest had to compete with income. The room was never simply a refuge from the market. The market came in, sat down and charged rent. Even sleep could become scheduled around work, borders, noise, and space. Some families may have slept in shifts when crowding required it. Others may do with arrangements that changed nightly, depending on who was present and who had paid. The idea of a home as a private sanctuary was not completely absent, but it was constantly under attack by necessity. For new immigrants, these rooms could still matter deeply. That is one of the harder things to hold. A room that looks intolerable to a visitor might be remembered by a family as the first place in America where they closed a door behind themselves. A damp cellar might be hated and still be defended against eviction. A crowded tenement might contain the first American-born child, the first wages saved, the first letter written home, the first winter survived. People do not need good housing to form attachments. They form attachments where life happens because life does not wait for proper conditions. That is why slum clearance, even when necessary, always carried an emotional cost. Reformers saw buildings to be demolished. Residents sometimes saw misery, yes, but also networks, neighbours, familiar routes, credit relationships, churches, saloons, shops, and rooms where their dead had been waked. Bad housing can still be home, which is one reason urban reform has always been more complicated than simply tearing down the worst structures and declaring progress. Still, no tenderness about memory should soften the facts. The interiors of 5 Points helped produce the neighbourhood's danger, not because poor people were naturally dangerous, but because concentrated neglect changes social life. When people are crowded, sick, underemployed, watched, judged, and offered little lawful protection, informal power grows. A landlord's agent may matter more than a city official. A saloon keeper may offer credit when no bank will. A gang may provide protection from another gang, then demand loyalty. A political boss may help with a job, a court fine, a funeral, or a bag of coal, and expect votes in return. These arrangements do not grow only in alleys. They grow in buildings where official systems have failed. The tenement was therefore not separate from the saloon, the gang, the ward boss, or the mission house. It fed all of them. It produced the needs that others could exploit or answer. Housing was the first government most residents encountered, and it was governed by rent. By evening, the building changed again. Daylight, limited as it was, withdrew from the narrow windows and courts. Interior rooms went dark early. Candles cost money. Oil cost money. Fuel cost money. People gathered where light existed, or they moved to the street, or they went to saloons and dance halls where heat, light, sound, and company could be found for the price of a drink, a song, a favour, or a risk. This matters because nightlife in 5 Points cannot be understood apart from housing. If your room is dark, damp, overcrowded, and tense, the saloon is not merely temptation. It is space. If your home has no air, the street is not merely delinquency. It is relief. If your building gives you no privacy, public places become extensions of domestic life. Reformers often asked why residents spent so much time in saloons, dance cellars, and streets. One answer is that the rented room gave them too little reason to stay inside. The darkness that paid rent also pushed people outward into the public life that made 5 Points famous. So when we imagine a night in the neighbourhood, we should not begin with a gang fight or the police raid. Begin with the room. Begin with a woman trying to stretch a small fire. Begin with a man sitting on the edge of a bed because there is no chair. Begin with 2 children sharing space under a coat. Begin with a boarder breathing heavily in the corner. Begin with damp plaster, a weak candle, a pot that has to feed too many, and a landlord who will come whether work was found or not. Begin with the cellar door, and the smell that rises when it opens. Begin with the stairs, because every resident has to pass through them, and every stair knows more about the neighbourhood than the newspapers ever did. The danger of 5 Points was built upward from these interiors. The streets gave it a stage, but the tenements gave it pressure. And once the pressure had built long enough indoors, it spilled back out into the saloons, dance halls, fire companies, political clubs, and gangs that made the neighbourhood's name travel far beyond the mud where it began. The people who arrived in 5 Points did not step into an empty ruin. They stepped into rooms already shaped by other hands, streets already carrying other languages, churches already gathering frightened families, saloons already keeping credit for men who had not been paid, and corners already claimed by children who knew the neighbourhood better than any map. That is one of the first things to understand about immigrant life there. New arrivals were poor, often exhausted, sometimes sick, often cheated, and almost always vulnerable. But they were not simply dropped into disorder like stones into mud. They entered a world that had rules, customs, warnings, loyalties, and opportunities, even when those opportunities were small, risky, and badly paid. 5 Points looked like collapse to outsiders because outsiders saw the broken stairs, the crowded rooms, the drunk men, the police reports, the ragged children, the women carrying water, the black and Irish dancers in halls that made respectable visitors nervous, the German shops, the Jewish peddlers, the Chinese laundries that would come later, and the endless movement of people with no space to be still. But for many residents, especially those who had just crossed an ocean or escaped a life with even fewer choices, the neighbourhood was not only a pit, it was a beginning, a hard beginning, and sometimes a cruel one, but still a place where a person could find someone who spoke a familiar word, knew of a job, had a cousin with floor space, kept a boarding house, knew which employer paid on time, knew which policeman to avoid, knew which priest or preacher could help with a burial, and knew how to survive until the next day without making the wrong enemy. By the 1840s and 1850s, 5 Points was absorbing people whose histories had collided in Lower Manhattan for reasons none of them fully controlled. Irish families came in enormous numbers, many driven by famine, eviction, disease, and the shattering of rural life back home. German immigrants arrived with their own languages, trades, political traditions, religious differences, and hopes for stability. Free black New Yorkers, some with roots in the city that reached back before emancipation, lived and worked in and around the district while facing discrimination that law alone had not erased. Jewish residents, including German-speaking Jews and later Eastern European arrivals, found footholds in the world of peddling, small trade, tailoring, and rented rooms. Italian immigrants would become more visible in the district later in the century, and Chinese residents would also enter the neighbourhood story as Lower Manhattan changed again. The exact composition shifted across the decades, but the pattern remained. 5 Points received those who were useful to the city's economy, and unwelcome in many of the city's better streets. Here is what that meant in daily terms. A newcomer rarely arrived with a clear plan. He arrived with directions scribbled on paper, a family name, the address of a boarding house, a parish connection, or nothing more than the knowledge that others from his country had gone to the same district. If he was Irish, he might be told to look near Baxter Street, around the Points, near the cheap lodging houses where a man could sleep among strangers and hear the old accent at the table. If she was a woman travelling with children, the first question was not what America promised, but where the children would sleep tonight and whether anyone would extend credit for food. A German craftsman might search for people from the same region and learn which blocks held German-speaking households. A black family might remain close to church networks, mutual aid, abolitionist contacts, and neighbours who understood the danger of being isolated in a city that could turn hostile very quickly. A Jewish peddler might move through streets where every small transaction mattered. Buying, selling, repairing, carrying, bargaining, building a life from motion. These people didn't enter 5 Points as one unified class called the poor. They entered as Catholics, Protestants, Jews, free black citizens, famine refugees, widows, labourers, sailors, children, servants, artisans, laundresses, peddlers, fugitives, and people who had been poor long enough to know that survival usually began with someone else's name. That is why networks mattered so much. In a neighbourhood like 5 Points, information could be as valuable as money. A man who knew where work was hiring in the morning had something to sell or share. A woman who knew which household needed laundry done could pass a chance to a neighbour. A boarding house keeper who spoke your language could overcharge you, protect you, feed you, exploit you, or all of those in the same week. A saloon keeper might hold wages, extend credit, introduce workers to contractors, or help a political boss deliver votes. A church could help with food, schooling, funerals, and the emotional work of making a strange country feel less hostile. Mutual aid societies were not decorative. They were practical tools against sickness, burial costs, unemployment, and the terror of dying with no one to claim you. For immigrants, especially in the first years, America was not experienced as a nation. It was experienced as a set of people who either helped you or did not. 5 Points, for all its violence and filth, offered density, and density meant contact. Contact could ruin you, but it could also save you. Let's take the Irish first, because their presence became so central to the neighbourhood's reputation that later stories often made 5 Points sound almost entirely Irish. That was never completely true, but the Irish did help define the district in the public imagination. They came into a city already suspicious of them. Many native-born Protestants saw Irish Catholics as poor, dependent, drunken, politically dangerous, religiously obedient to Rome, and racially suspect in ways that shifted depending on who was speaking. The stereotype arrived before many of the immigrants had even found beds. Imagine entering a country where people have already decided what your face means. You look for work and are told, openly or silently, that your accent lowers your value. You search for a room and learn that some landlords do not want your kind unless the building is already bad enough that they have no better tenants. You look at a police officer and cannot be certain whether he sees a resident or a problem. You go to Mass because the church is one of the few institutions that speaks to you without mockery. You send a child to work because wages are necessary. You drink because your body hurts, because the boarding house is noisy, because grief has crossed the ocean with you, because a saloon is warm and full of voices, because the same place that threatens you also makes you feel less alone. Outsiders saw the drinking and stopped there. They did not always see the hunger underneath it. Irish women carried a particular burden in this world. Many went into domestic service in homes where their labour was needed and their presence was judged. Others took in washing, sold goods, cared for children, kept lodging houses, cooked, cleaned, mended, and managed rooms that were always too crowded. Some arrived alone, not as appendages to husbands or fathers, but as workers whose wages could support relatives in New York or back in Ireland. A young Irish woman in service might sleep in a kitchen or attic in a better neighbourhood during the week, and return to 5 Points or nearby streets on a free evening to see kin, attend church, or breathe for a few hours among people who did not hear her accent as an insult. Another woman might run a small boarding arrangement from a rented room, turning poverty into a kind of business because she had no other capital. The home became a workplace, a shelter, and a risk. Boarders brought rent, but also strangers. Cooking fed people, but also cost fuel. Laundry brought coins, but filled a room with steam and wet cloth. The women who built immigrant life in 5 Points did not always build it with brick. They built it by stretching food, sharing news, taking in relatives, burying babies, keeping prayer, handling landlords, and making the room hold one more person than it should. Black residents lived under a different but overlapping pressure. New York's gradual emancipation had ended slavery in the state by 1827, but freedom came into a city that still restricted opportunity and dignity. Black New Yorkers faced job discrimination, mob violence, voting restrictions, segregated or hostile institutions, and the constant awareness that the legal end of slavery did not mean the end of white control. In and around 5 Points, black communities created spaces of worship, organising, labour, pleasure and protection. Some residents worked as waiters, sailors, labourers, laundresses, cooks, domestic servants, barbers, musicians, dancers, and in other trades available under unequal conditions. The neighbourhood's closeness to abolitionist networks and its role as a refuge for some escaping slavery gave it a meaning that outsiders often ignored. To one visitor, 5 Points might look like degradation. To a fugitive, a crowded black household with people willing to hide, guide or warn could mean life. Safety in such a place was never simple. The same streets that offered cover could expose someone to informers, violence, or police. But community was not theoretical there. It was a practice, and sometimes a dangerous one. This is where the mingling of Irish and black life becomes one of the most complicated and important parts of the story. The two groups lived near each other, competed for some kinds of work, shared some spaces, clashed at times, and influenced each other in ways that later became part of American culture. Dance halls in 5 Points became famous precisely because they crossed boundaries that respectable society wanted enforced. Almack's, run by the black proprietor Pete Williams on Orange Street, drew visitors because it showed them something they did not know how to categorise: black and white, Irish and African American, poor and sometimes curious outsiders, all sharing a room where music and dance moved faster than social rules. Charles Dickens visited such a place in the early 1840s and came away fascinated, though not free from the prejudices of his time. Other writers described mixed dancing with horror, excitement, or both. The dance itself mattered. Irish step traditions, African American rhythms, juba dancing, reels, hornpipes, shuffles, and competitive movement met in rooms like these, and from that exchange came forms that helped shape tap dance and later American entertainment. It would be too simple to call this harmony. It was not. But it was contact intense enough to create something new. Think about that room for a moment, not as a tourist spectacle, but as a working neighbourhood space. The air is hot. The floorboards take the beat from boots and heels. Someone plays fiddle. Someone claps time. A man laughs too loudly near the wall. A woman watches the door because pleasure in 5 Points still required caution. A dancer steps into the centre, and for a few minutes the body does what the city has not allowed the person to do. It commands attention. It controls space. It makes skill visible. In a neighbourhood where poverty turned people into statistics and stereotypes, performance could give a person a name. Master Juba, the great black dancer William Henry Lane, came out of this world and astonished audiences with a style that white observers struggled to describe because they lacked the vocabulary for what they were seeing. The stage, or even the cleared floor of a dance hall, became one of the few places where a poor black performer could seize admiration from people who might deny him respect in every other setting. That does not make the room innocent. Exploitation followed black performance into every market that profited from it. But the brilliance was real, and 5 Points helped produce it. The Germans built differently, often through trade, family business, beer culture, skilled labour, and associations that could create stability over time. German immigrants in New York were diverse, divided by region, religion, politics, and class. Some were Catholics, some Protestants, some Jews, some freethinkers, some radicals shaped by the revolutions of 1848. In and around Lower Manhattan, German-speaking residents opened shops, worked as bakers, butchers, tailors, carpenters, musicians, saloon keepers, and artisans. Their presence complicated the neighbourhood's public image, because the loudest stories usually preferred the Irish and black drama of 5 Points. But German immigrants were part of the same crowded urban fabric, and their institutions mattered. A German beer cellar was not the same social world as an Irish grog shop, though both might be condemned by reformers under the broad category of drink. A German singing society, mutual aid group, church or reading circle could carry a piece of Europe into the city and make the immigrant less alone. For poor German families, 5 Points might be a temporary foothold before moving to other German neighbourhoods. For others, it was simply where the rent was possible. Jewish residents also made lives in the district, often in ways that left less dramatic traces in sensational writing, but mattered deeply to the economic life of the streets. Peddling was one of the paths available to immigrants with little capital because it required motion, endurance, bargaining, and a small stock of goods rather than a shop. A peddler could carry needles, cloth, trinkets, used clothes, household items, or whatever might sell in small quantities to people with little cash. Tailoring and the clothing trades also drew Jewish workers. This was hard work, often unstable, but it allowed families to build networks of credit and skill. Jewish life in Lower Manhattan would become far more visible later with Eastern European immigration, but even in the mid-19th century world of 5 Points, Jewish residents were part of the broader story of people turning marginal space into a ladder, however shaky. Their religious rhythms, food practices, languages, and family structures added yet another layer to streets outsiders preferred to describe as one undifferentiated mass of vice. What all these groups shared was not sameness but pressure. They shared overcrowding, low wages, bad housing, public suspicion, and the need to make institutions where official ones failed. They formed churches, benevolent societies, informal credit networks, boarding systems, labour connections, political loyalties, entertainment spaces, and neighbourhood reputations. They argued, competed, loved, resented, imitated, borrowed, and watched one another. A child growing up in 5 Points might hear Irish songs, black spiritual and dance rhythms, German speech, street cries, Catholic bells, Protestant hymns, curses in several accents, and the language of bargaining before he ever learned to read properly. A girl might know which woman sold bread, which family kept awake properly, which alley to avoid, which saloon had music, which missionary offered schooling, and which insult could start a fight. This was not the clean immigrant uplift story that later generations sometimes prefer. It was messy, close, and often painful. But it was also creative in the most practical sense. People created ways to live where the city had provided only ways to be used. Politics entered through the same door as rent and work. Poor immigrants needed help, and political organisations understood the power of help. A ward boss or local political operator could assist with jobs, naturalisation, food, rent trouble, or protection from the law. In return, he expected votes and loyalty. For Irish immigrants especially, politics became a route into belonging, power, and eventually city government. This process was often condemned as corruption, and sometimes it was corruption plainly. Votes were bought, fights were arranged, offices were traded, gangs were used, and favours mattered more than rules. But the moral judgment becomes too easy if we forget what formal respectability offered the poor before political machines stepped in. A man who could not get fair treatment from an employer, landlord, or court might find that a local political connection was the only institution that answered when called. Democracy in 5 Points did not look clean. It looked like favours, funerals, job, saloon meetings, naturalisation papers, torchlight processions, and men at the polls who knew how to turn numbers into power. The immigrants did not simply fall into American politics. They were pulled, trained, used, and in time they used the system back. Religion offered a different kind of structure. Catholic churches gave Irish immigrants spiritual continuity and practical support in a Protestant city that often treated them as a threat. Black churches provided worship, leadership, education, anti-slavery organising, mutual aid, and dignity in a society determined to deny it. Protestant missions entered 5 Points with a mixture of compassion, discipline, cultural judgment, and reforming ambition. Some missionaries genuinely helped residents with food, schooling, shelter, and care. Others saw the neighbourhood as a field of souls to be corrected, and sometimes failed to distinguish between poverty and sin. Still, for families inside the district, any institution that could feed a child, teach reading, arrange a burial, or intervene in crisis mattered. A mother might not agree with every sermon, and still send a child to a mission school, because literacy could change a future. A man might resent reformers and still accept help when there was no work. The neighbourhood was full of such compromises. Survival often required accepting aid from people who misunderstood you. Food carried memory into these rooms. Irish families stretched potatoes, bread, tea, salt meat, and whatever could be bought cheaply. German households brought sausages, rye bread, beer, cabbage, and food habits that made a rented room feel less foreign. Black cooks preserved techniques, flavours, and communal practices shaped by both northern free life and the wider African Atlantic world. Jewish families maintained dietary traditions when possible under hard circumstances, adjusting when poverty made strictness difficult. Street food, cheap oysters, stale bread, soup, beer, coffee and vendor goods moved through the district. Meals were not only fuel, they were reminders that people had belonged somewhere before the tenement. A pot on a stove could carry a county, a language, a mother's method, a religious rule, or a compromise with American prices. This matters because immigrant identity often survived in small repeated acts. A prayer, a song, a way of cutting bread, a saint's day, a Sabbath habit, a dance step, a wake, a lullaby, a joke that only makes sense in the old tongue. 5 Points was not just where immigrants lost things, it was where they guarded what could still be carried. And they buried their dead there, or from there, and that too built community. Death was frequent in poor neighbourhoods, especially among children. Disease, workplace accidents, violence, childbirth and hunger took people with a regularity that forced residents to become practised in grief. A funeral required money, organisation and witnesses. Mutual aid societies often existed, partly so members would not be buried as paupers. For immigrants, a proper burial was a statement that a life had value, even if the city had priced that life cheaply. Wakes brought people into crowded rooms where mourning, drinking, prayer, memory and social obligation met. Outsiders might see only disorder. Residents knew the difference between a drunken gathering and the rituals that made death bearable. In a place where so many were described as nameless, burying someone properly was one way to insist on a name. The ruins, then, were not empty. They were full of construction. Not the official construction of clean buildings and planned streets, but the human construction of a world under pressure. Immigrants built with relationships because they had little property. They built with memory because so much else had been taken. They built with performance because public skill could earn what private dignity was denied. They built with churches, saloons, boarding houses, political clubs, aid societies, dance floors, street markets and kitchen tables. They built by sending for relatives, sharing rooms, lending coins, warning newcomers, teaching children, fighting rivals, making alliances, and taking whatever the city gave them, then bending it toward survival. This is why 5 Points cannot be understood only as America's most dangerous neighbourhood. It was also one of America's most intense workshops of urban immigrant life. The danger and the creativity came from the same closeness. People were pressed together until they harmed each other, helped each other, copied each other, feared each other, and made something new because separation was too expensive. By evening, that world became visible in a different way. Work slowed or failed. Men returned with wages or without them. Women counted what could be spent. Children came in from errands or stayed in the street because the room was too crowded. A fiddle began somewhere. A church meeting gathered elsewhere. A saloon filled because it offered heat, light, credit, news, and escape. A dance hall opened its doors. A political man listened for who needed help and who could be useful. A newcomer followed someone down a street he did not yet know, trusting the sound of a familiar accent. A black musician tuned an instrument. An Irish labourer stamped time with his boot. A German shopkeeper closed his shutters. A Jewish peddler counted the day's small earnings. A mother looked at her sleeping child and wondered whether the next rent day could be met. The old building still leaned. The mud still clung. The police still watched badly or too closely. The newspapers still waited for a story. But inside the ruin, people had made a living world. And once a living world forms, it creates its own power. Some of that power becomes music. Some becomes politics. Some becomes protection. Some becomes crime. And in 5 points, as the night gathered and the doors of the saloon swung open, those forms of power began to meet one another in the streets. The rooms pushed people outward. That is one of the simplest ways to understand what happened next. If a family's rented room was dark, damp, crowded, noisy, and full of other people's breathing, then the street became more than a street. It became a hallway, a workplace, a meeting room, a playground, a hiring office, an argument, a market, and sometimes the only place where a person could stand without touching another body. 5 Points did not sleep neatly, because it did not live neatly. The neighbourhood spilled out of its buildings because the buildings could not hold the lives packed inside them. By late afternoon, when labourers came back from the docks or from construction sites, or from a day of looking for work and finding none, the streets began to change their purpose. Children who had been running errands or selling small things stayed outside because inside was too crowded. Women leaned in doorways to speak to neighbours while still keeping one ear turned toward a baby or a pot or a boarder who had not yet paid. Men gathered near saloons because saloons had light, warmth, drink, news, credit, politics, and the one thing poor housing rarely gave them, a place to sit among other men and be seen. That does not make the saloon harmless. It makes it important. A saloon in 5 Points was not just a room where alcohol was sold. It was one of the neighbourhood's working institutions. It could be rough, exploitative, loud, violent, and ruinous. But it could also be useful in ways that a reformer standing at the door might not understand. A man might hear where a contractor needed labourers in the morning. A newcomer might find someone from the same county in Ireland or the same region of Germany. A ward politician might keep track of who needed coal, who had a court problem, who was ready to vote, and who could be persuaded with a favour. A saloon keeper might extend credit until payday, and then take back more than he had given. A gang might use the room as a meeting place, a shield, or a source of recruits. A woman might avoid it because she knew what happened to wages there, or enter it because her own survival depended on selling food, drink, company, music, lodging, or information around it. In a neighbourhood where official systems were distant or hostile, the saloon answered quickly. That was part of its danger. It met real needs and charged for them in ways that could hollow out a life. Imagine one of those rooms just after dark. Not the polished bar of later nostalgia, not a place made charming by old wood and low light, but a crowded interior smelling of cheap spirits, tobacco, sweat, damp wool, sawdust, smoke, and mud carried in on boots. The floor is dirty because the street has come inside with everyone who enters. The light is not bright, but compared with the tenement room it may feel almost generous. Voices overlap. A man tells a story too loudly because he wants the room to know he is not afraid. Another sits with his back to the wall because that is a habit learned from streets where surprise is not always friendly. Someone laughs. Someone swears. Someone sings a line from a song everyone knows. A political argument begins near the counter and becomes a personal insult before anyone can say exactly when it changed. A boy runs in with a message. A woman at the edge of the room watches who is spending and who is already too drunk. Behind the counter, the keeper understands that his business is not only drink, it is memory. He knows who owes, who fights, who votes, who can be useful, and who is one disappointment away from doing something foolish. For men whose work was irregular and whose authority at home was weakened by poverty, the saloon offered a public version of importance. That is not an excuse for what often followed, but it helps explain the pull. A labourer might spend all day waiting to be chosen, ordered about, underpaid, insulted, or ignored. In the saloon he could speak loudly, slap a shoulder, join a song, take sides, call himself by a nickname, belong to a group, or become for an hour the sort of man others watched. Alcohol made that feeling easier and more dangerous. It softened grief and sharpened insult. It made courage cheaper. It turned a joke into a challenge into a shove into a fight, and a fight into a reputation. In 5 Points, reputation mattered. A young man without money, property, education, or steady work could still possess a name that made people step aside. That kind of name was expensive. It had to be earned in public and defended in public, which meant the street and the saloon kept feeding each other. The gangs grew from this world, but we should be careful with the word gang. Modern ears hear it and imagine a structured criminal organisation with clear leadership, steady income, territory, rules, and a business model. Some later New York gangs moved closer to that, but many of the early 5 Points groups were looser, more like clusters of young men tied to neighbourhood, ethnicity, fire companies, political clubs, saloons, and the need for belonging. They fought, they stole, they intimidated, they guarded corners, they turned out for elections, they marched, drank, brawled, and sometimes killed. But they were also part of a broader street culture where male identity, local pride, politics, and violence were difficult to separate. A gang could be criminal one moment, political muscle the next, a fire company's allies the next, and a crowd of neighbourhood boys defending their own block after that. The categories were not as clean as later crime stories make them seem. 5 Points produced or was associated with names that became part of New York legend. The Roach Guards, the Chichesters, the Shirt Tails, the Plug Uglies, the Kerryonians, the Dead Rabbits. Some names are better documented than others. Some were exaggerated by newspapers. Some were repeated by later writers who loved the sound of them so much that the names began to feel larger than the people. That is one of the strange things about the history of gangs in old New York. The names have survived with a brightness the actual lives rarely have. A young man who might have been hungry, illiterate, grieving, underemployed, and trapped in a room with too many people, becomes in memory a figure with a dangerous nickname and a brick in his hand. The nickname remains. The hunger fades. History has a weakness for men with memorable names, especially when those names can be printed beside violence. The Dead Rabbits are the best example of that problem. They are probably the most famous gang associated with 5 Points, but historians have warned that the name itself is not as straightforward as popular memory suggests. Some residents later insisted there was no formal gang by that name. The phrase may have been attached by newspapers and outsiders to a broader set of Irish working-class fighters in the district, especially after the violence of 1857, and yet, whether the Dead Rabbits were a formal gang in the way later readers imagine, or a label that hardened around a riot, the name tells us something real about the city. It tells us that middle-class New Yorkers had become fascinated and frightened by Irish street power. It tells us that the press knew how to turn poverty into a character. It tells us that 5 Points had become famous enough that a fight there could become national theatre. Their most famous rivals were the Bowery Boys, from the nearby Bowery, a different working-class world with a different identity. The Bowery was not a rich district, but compared with 5 Points, it carried a stronger sense of native-born working-class respectability. The Bowery Boys were linked to nativist politics, anti-Irish feeling, anti-Catholic sentiment, volunteer fire companies, tradesmen, mechanics, butchers, and the rough pride of men who saw themselves as real Americans defending their streets against immigrant disorder. They dressed with a recognizable swagger. Accounts describe silk hats, red shirts, boots, careful hair, a theatrical masculinity that made the Bowery Boy not only a fighter but a type. He was a street performer of native-born toughness. He might work honestly by day and brawl violently by night, and in his own mind there may have been no contradiction. He represented order against 5 points, at least according to his own story. To the people he attacked, that order looked very much like another kind of mob. The rivalry between 5 Points gangs and Bowery groups was never only about personal hatred. It carried ethnicity, religion, politics, labour competition, neighbourhood pride, and the anxiety of a city changing faster than many residents could accept. Irish Catholic immigrants were entering New York in huge numbers. Native-born Protestants feared losing political control, cultural dominance, and jobs. Political machines, especially democratic organisations, courted immigrant votes. Nativist groups tried to resist that power. Street gangs became the muscle of these anxieties. Election day could become a test of force. Polling places were not always calm sites of civic participation. Men might be intimidated, repeat voting might be arranged, ballots might be defended or stolen, and a gang's ability to control a street could affect a party's strength. In that world, a young man who knew how to fight was not merely a criminal nuisance, he was a political resource. This is one of the central facts of 5 Points nightlife. Violence did not live outside politics. It often worked for politics. The ward system gave local power enormous importance. A saloon could become a political office without changing its sign. A gang leader or saloon keeper might know exactly how many votes he could deliver and what those votes were worth. Tammany Hall, the democratic machine that would become so powerful in New York, understood immigrant neighbourhoods better than many respectable reformers did. It offered help where the city offered judgment. That help came with strings, and the strings were thick. A man who received assistance might be expected to vote correctly, bring others, attend rallies, join a crowd, or look away when another man did something illegal for the cause. This is how corruption becomes durable. It attaches itself to real needs. A hungry family does not experience machine politics as a theory. It experiences it as coal, a job, bail, food, rent help, funeral money, or protection from someone worse. The volunteer fire companies added another layer of disorder. Before New York developed a modern professional fire department, firefighting depended heavily on volunteer companies, and these companies were often neighbourhood institutions with fierce pride, elaborate identities, and real capacity for violence. They raced to fires because being first mattered. They competed for honour, equipment, reputation, and influence. Sometimes rival fire companies fought each other while buildings burned. Sometimes gang members attached themselves to fire companies as runners and muscle. A fire in the city was therefore not only an emergency, it could be a public contest. Men dragged engines through streets, shouted, shoved, challenged rivals, and sometimes used the chaos of fire as a cover for looting or revenge. To modern ears, this sounds absurd because we imagine emergency services as neutral. In mid-19th century New York, even fire could become political and territorial. Now picture a night alarm near 5 Points. A bell rings or a cry goes up. Doors open, men pour out, some half-dressed, some already drunk, some running because fire is danger and spectacle at once. The engine company moves through the street with ropes pulled by men, wheels striking ruts, sparks or lanterns shifting in the dark. Another company appears from a different direction. Insults begin before water does. Someone claims priority. Someone says the other company has no right. A shove happens. A fist answers. Around them, residents are terrified because if the building burns, every family inside may lose everything. But for the men attached to rival companies, the fire is also a proving ground. The city's weakness is visible in that moment. The institution meant to protect property and lives is tangled with neighbourhood pride, male display, alcohol and violence. 5 Points did not create that system, but it lived within it intensely. The police were not yet the reliable modern force people imagine when they hear the word. New York's policing developed unevenly, and in the 1850s it was caught in political conflict. The struggle between the municipal police, aligned with Mayor Fernando Wood, and the state-created Metropolitan Police made law enforcement itself part of the disorder. In 1857, this conflict weakened the city's ability to respond to street violence at exactly the moment when tensions between gangs could explode. The Dead Rabbit Riot, or Dead Rabbits and Bowery Boys Riot as it was called, began around Independence Day in 1857 and expanded from a fight into a 2-day disturbance. Reports described hundreds of participants, looting, attacks, and the eventual need for militia support to restore order. The details vary across accounts, and the labels applied to the fighters were often shaped by newspaper language, but the larger point is clear. 5 Points had become a place where a local clash could overwhelm ordinary control and turn into a citywide symbol. Try to imagine being an ordinary resident during those days. Not a gang member, not a Bowery tough, not a reporter, just a woman with children in a tenement room, or an elderly man who wants no part of anyone's politics, or a shopkeeper who cannot afford broken windows. The sound changes first. Crowds have a sound before they have a visible shape. Running feet, shouts moving closer, a bottle breaking. The deep noise of many men speaking at once without conversation. Then the rumours arrive. The Bowery Boys are coming. The 5 Points men are moving. Police have been beaten back. Someone has a pistol. Someone is dead. Someone is not dead, but will be by morning. In a poor neighbourhood, rumours are not entertainment. They are warnings. A mother pulls a child inside. A man bars a door. Someone goes out anyway because he has a brother in the street. Someone else watches from a window because to know what is happening is safer than ignorance. The riot may become legend later, but while it is happening, it is mainly fear, confusion, noise, and the terrible knowledge that the city may not be able to protect you. Newspapers loved this material. They loved it even when they claimed to deplore it. A gang fight in 5 Points could be turned into moral warning, ethnic caricature, political argument, entertainment, and proof that reform was needed. Illustrations of Irish fighters made them look brutish, ragged, and almost less than human, fitting the racial prejudice of the time. A man holding a brick became an image of immigrant danger, but those images were not neutral documentation. They were part of the fight over what the city believed about its poor. To portray 5 Points men as animalistic was to make their suffering easier to dismiss and their policing easier to justify. It was also a way for native-born readers to feel that the immigrants were not simply poor neighbours, but a threat from another order of life. That is why we have to read those images carefully. They show us the riot, but they also show us the viewer. Still, the violence was real. It is dishonest to reduce every account of 5 Points crime to prejudice. People were robbed there. People were beaten there. People were killed there. Women were exploited. Children were recruited into theft. Visitors could be targeted. Residents could be trapped between gangs, police landlords, and drunken men with reputations to defend. The point is not to deny the danger. The point is to understand how it was made. A neighbourhood becomes dangerous when legitimate authority fails, when poverty is concentrated, when public space is overcrowded, when young men have few prospects and many audiences, when drink is one of the few affordable anaesthetics, when political actors reward violence, when housing pushes life outdoors, and when newspapers turn every fight into proof that the people themselves are the disease. 5 Points had all of these conditions at once. There were also women in the nightlife, and not merely as victims in the background. Women ran boarding houses, sold liquor, kept dance houses, worked in prostitution, performed, cooked, laundered, carried messages, managed credit, and negotiated with men whose pride was easily bruised. Some were exploited brutally, some exploited others. Some did both at different times, because hard places do not always let people remain morally simple. A woman running a disorderly house might be condemned by reformers, but she might also be a businesswoman in the only market open to her. A sex worker might be described only as fallen, but her actual life could include hunger, coercion, choice, debt, illness, humour, friendship, and calculation. A dancer in a mixed hall might be treated as evidence of vice by a visitor and as a skilled performer by the room. Respectable language often flattened such women into types, because types are easier to pity or punish than people. The dance halls deserve more care because they were among the places where 5 points became culturally important. Music and dancing were not side notes to the neighbourhood's history, they were part of its public life. Mixed-race dance spaces alarmed outsiders because they challenged the social boundaries that the wider city worked hard to maintain. Black dancers, Irish dancers, musicians, drinkers, labourers, sailors, sex workers, tourists, and local toughs could occupy the same room, not as equals in any broad social sense, but as participants in one charged environment. The floor became a place where the poor performed energy that the city usually described as disorder. Tap dance and other American popular forms later carried traces of these encounters. That does not mean 5 points was some cheerful laboratory of multicultural art. It means that culture is often made in rooms where people are pressed together by necessity, watched by prejudice, and still determined to move. There is a scene worth holding for a moment. It is late, but the neighbourhood is still awake because sleep is difficult when rooms are crowded and the street has not gone quiet. A saloon door opens and lets out a wedge of light. Inside, a fiddle or banjo keeps time. A man staggers into the street, laughing until another man says something he does not like. A boy watches from the curb, learning how men become feared. A woman crosses quickly with her shawl pulled close. Somewhere a political organiser is talking about a coming election. Somewhere a policeman decides whether entering a room is worth the trouble. Somewhere a gang member hears that rivals have been seen near the Bowery. In an upper room, a sick child tries to sleep through the noise. Below street level, in a cellar, someone wakes to boots overhead and knows the night is not finished. This is what it meant for the streets not to sleep. It was not excitement for everyone, it was exposure. For the men who became street fighters, the neighbourhood offered a harsh education. They learned the uses of group loyalty. Alone, a poor young man could be beaten, cheated, ignored, or arrested. In a group, he could intimidate. He could defend a corner. He could move through hostile streets. He could feel important. He could become useful to older men with political connections. He could earn money by theft, protection, election work, or muscle. He could also die early, be jailed, be maimed, become addicted, or spend his life mistaking fear for respect. That is one of the saddest parts of this history. A gang gave young men status in a world that denied them stable dignity. It solved one problem by creating another. The city then pointed to the violence and called the young men naturally criminal, ignoring how many legitimate routes to manhood had been blocked or priced beyond reach. The saloon keeper, the ward boss, the fire company captain, the gang leader, the boarding house keeper, and the police officer all formed part of the neighbourhood's informal government. They did not hold equal power, and they did not always cooperate, but residents had to know how to deal with each of them. Official maps showed streets. Real maps showed relationships. Which saloon was safe for your people? Which corner belonged to which group? Which officer took money? Which politician could get someone released? Which fire company would defend its own? Which gang had a feud that might spill into your block? Which night was dangerous because an election, holiday, funeral, fire or rumour had stirred the men? This knowledge was practical. It could keep a person alive. It also meant that children grew up reading Power before they could read books. Independence Day was especially charged. A holiday meant to celebrate national belonging became, in a city divided by ethnicity and politics, a stage for arguments over who counted as American. Nativist groups claimed the symbols of the Republic. Immigrants, especially Irish Catholics, asserted their own place in public life. Drinking increased. Crowds formed. Fireworks, weapons, parades, flags and insults all moved through the same streets. The 1857 violence did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a city where public celebration could easily turn into public combat, because the meaning of the nation itself was being fought over by men who had little else but the street on which to make their claim. That is why a gang fight could become more than a gang fight. It touched the city's fear of immigration, democracy, policing, class and control. By the later 1850s and into the 1860s, 5 Points was no longer simply a poor neighbourhood with local troubles. It had become a national symbol of urban danger. The saloons and gangs helped make that symbol visible, but the symbol was never fully accurate. It magnified the most violent men and made them stand for everyone. It turned the saloon into the only room that mattered and ignored the kitchen, the church, the mission school, the workshop, the sick bed, and the family trying to keep rent together. It treated every street gathering as a threat and every poor young man as a future criminal. At the same time, the symbol did capture something real about how unstable the neighbourhood had become. 5 Points was not safe. Its streets could be violent. Its nightlife could swallow wages and lives. Its gangs could turn politics into blood sport. Its saloons could function as both refuge and trap. The contradiction is the truth. 5 Points was more dangerous than its defenders might wish to admit, and more human than its enemies wanted to know. Near midnight, the neighbourhood would not become silent so much as thin out. Some men slept where they fell. Others returned to crowded rooms carrying the smell of drink into spaces where women had been waiting with anger, fear, resignation, or no energy left for any of those. A gang member might vanish into an alley or climb stairs to a room where he was no legend, just someone's son or brother. The saloon keeper counted money. A political man remembered promises made in drunken confidence. A policeman wrote little or nothing down depending on what had happened and who mattered. A child half-woker's boots entered the room. Somewhere, music continued after it should have stopped. Somewhere, a fight that began as a joke ended with blood on a shirt. The streets had not slept because the forces inside them had no reason to rest. Hunger, pride, fear, politics, loneliness, drink, work, and the need to belong. And outside the neighbourhood, people were beginning to pay closer attention. Some came as reformers, carrying Bibles, school books, soup, moral certainty and genuine concern. Some came as reporters, carrying notebooks and a talent for making poverty terrifying enough to sell. Some came as tourists, guided through the district as if 5 Points were a foreign country inside New York. They walked past the saloons, the children, the dance halls, the crowded doorways, and the corners where young men watched them watching. They went home with stories. Those stories would soon become another force in the neighbourhood, almost as powerful as rent or police. 5 Points had been built from mud, poverty, immigration and neglect. Now it was going to be built again in print, in sermons, in reform reports, in sketches, and in the imaginations of people who had never spent a night there. The stories began to gather around 5 Points almost as densely as the people did. That is what happened once the neighbourhood became too visible to ignore. First came the poor, crowded into buildings that had already failed. Then came the saloons, the gangs, the dance halls, the night noise, the police reports, and the election fights. Then came the visitors. They did not all come for the same reason. Some came because they believed souls could be saved there. Some came because they believed children could be rescued before the streets claimed them. Some came because poverty frightened them, and they wanted proof that their fear was justified. Some came because newspapers needed scenes that would hold a reader's attention over breakfast. Some came because they were curious in the way people are curious about a fire after they know they are standing far enough away not to burn. 5 Points became a place people entered in order to leave with a story, and that changed the neighbourhood almost as much as rent or mud ever had. A poor district can suffer quietly for a long time, but once outsiders discover that its suffering can be described, sold, preached over, sketched, toured, and turned into evidence, the place begins to live a second life. There is the neighbourhood where people sleep, work, fight, eat, pray, and bury their dead. And then there is the neighbourhood printed in reports and newspapers. 5 Points had both, and the printed one often travelled farther. This matters because the terrible legend of 5 Points was not born only from lies. That would be too easy. It was born from real crowding, real disease, real violence, real neglect, and real desperation, but it was shaped by people who usually did not live there, and who brought their own fears with them when they walked in. A reformer saw sin and suffering, a missionary saw souls, a reporter saw drama, a police official saw disorder, a tourist saw danger made convenient, a landlord saw rent, a political boss saw votes, a resident saw home, even if home was a damp room with too many people in it. The legend became terrible because it took one of those views, the outsider's view, and made it sound like the whole truth. One of the most famous early visitors was Charles Dickens, who came to New York in 1842, already famous, already watchful, already interested in prisons, institutions, poverty, and the way modern cities treated the people pushed to their edges. He was taken through 5 Points as part of a kind of guided descent. That word descent matters because writers used it often, both literally and socially. They descended into cellars, into dance halls, into alleys, into what they imagined as the lower levels of urban life. Dickens visited Almack's, the black-owned dance hall on Orange Street, and wrote about the experience in American Notes. He did not invent 5 Points' reputation, but his description helped give it international force. When a writer like Dickens told readers that such a place existed in New York, the neighbourhood became more than a local embarrassment. It became proof that America, for all its talk of liberty and progress, had its own darkness. That was useful to Dickens, and uncomfortable for New York. The city liked to think of itself as energetic, commercial, ambitious rising. 5 Points showed another form of rising, disease rising from bad cellars, smoke rising from cheap fires, anger rising from crowded rooms, and the old buried water rising through the ground. Dickens was not the only one to look, and in some ways he was less important than the steady stream of local writers who turned the neighbourhood into material. By the 1840s and 1850s, urban journalism was learning how to take readers into places they would never visit alone. Writers described the city at night, the hidden city, the criminal city, the poor city, the city behind respectable doors. George G. Foster's New York by Gaslight, published in 1850 after appearing as sketches, belonged to this world. The title itself tells you the appeal. Gaslight did not simply illuminate streets, it changed the way people imagined the city after dark. It made nightlife visible enough to be consumed by readers who might never enter a dance cellar or brothel or saloon. Foster and writers like him presented themselves as guides, moving through shadowed spaces and returning with reports from the urban underworld. Some of what they wrote was observant, some was sympathetic, some was sensational. Often it was all three at once. That combination is powerful because sympathy makes sensation feel respectable, and sensation makes sympathy sell. 5 Points was perfect for this kind of writing. It was close enough to respectable New York that a writer could visit and return safely. It was poor enough to shock. It was racially mixed enough to disturb readers who feared social boundaries dissolving. It was immigrant enough to feed nativist anxiety. It was Catholic enough to alarm Protestant reformers. It was violent enough to support the stories told about it, and complex enough that those stories could always leave something out. A writer did not need to invent a crowded room or a drunken fight. He only needed to choose which crowded room and which drunken fight would stand for the entire neighbourhood. That act of selection is where legend begins, not in pure fiction, but in choosing one truth so repeatedly that every other truth becomes harder to hear. Reformers arrived with different tools, but they too helped build the legend. We should be fair to them. Many were genuinely disturbed by what they saw. Many provided food, schooling, clothing, medical care, religious instruction, and shelter to people who needed help badly. Some women involved in mission work entered rooms that city officials had neglected for years, and did work that was physically unpleasant, emotionally demanding, and socially difficult. They visited the sick. They tried to clothe children. They taught reading. They organised donations. They raised money from people who preferred to help from a distance. They saw bodies, not only statistics. At the same time, reform was rarely free from judgment. To many Protestant reformers, 5 Points was not only poor but morally wrong. Its poverty was mixed in their minds with intemperance, Catholicism, racial mixing, prostitution, Sabbath breaking, crime, and spiritual ignorance. They wanted to relieve suffering, but often they also wanted to remake the residents into a version of respectability that matched their own beliefs. That meant the help could be real, and the condescension real at the same time. A hungry child could benefit from a mission school even if the adults running it misunderstood the child's family. A sick woman could accept aid from people who quietly judged her religion, her room, her husband, or her manners. Survival often required receiving help from hands that also measured you. The 5 Points mission became one of the central symbols of this reform effort. In the early 1850s, the Methodist-linked Ladies' Home Missionary Society purchased the site of the old brewery, the infamous building that had come to represent the worst of the district. In 1852, the old brewery was torn down, and the mission replaced it. The symbolism was too strong for anyone to miss. A building associated with vice, overcrowding, poverty and danger would be demolished and replaced by a house of religion, education, cleanliness and reform. For supporters, this was a triumph. It gave donors a clear story. Darkness had been removed, light had entered, ruin had become mission. The image was powerful because it made urban reform feel possible in one dramatic act. Tear down the worst building, put something better in its place, and perhaps the neighbourhood itself could be redeemed. But cities do not work that neatly. The old brewery mattered, and its demolition may well have improved that corner, but the forces that created it did not vanish with the bricks. Bad housing remained, low wages remained, discrimination remained, alcohol remained, overcrowding remained, children still needed shoes, adults still needed rent. A mission could intervene in lives, sometimes beautifully, but it could not by itself change the economic structure that kept producing desperation. That is not a criticism of every missionary who worked there. It is simply the difference between charity and transformation. Charity can keep someone alive through the night. Transformation asks why the night was so dangerous in the first place. The 5 Points House of Industry, associated with the reformer Louis Pease, represented another approach. It offered schooling, meals, vocational training and employment, especially for women and children. That was significant because it recognised, at least in practical terms, that preaching alone would not solve hunger. People needed work, children needed instruction, women needed ways to earn that did not leave them fully dependent on men, landlords, or the street. The House of Industry still carried the assumptions of its time, including Protestant moral discipline and expectations about proper behaviour, but it understood labour as part of reform. That mattered in a neighbourhood where the line between vice and survival was often drawn by people who had never faced the choices they condemned. If a woman could earn through sewing instead of through the sexual economy, reformers saw moral rescue. The woman may have seen something simpler and more urgent, money that could be made without certain dangers. Both interpretations could be true, but the second was closer to the stomach. Reports from these missions became their own genre. They described rooms visited, children found, drunkards reformed, Women rescued, families clothed, prayers offered, schools filled, and souls brought toward respectable life. These reports had to persuade donors, so they required vividness. Donors needed to feel the horror of 5 points from a safe distance, and then feel that their money could do something about it. That created a narrative pattern. First, show the depth of misery, then show the heroism of the mission. Then show a rescued child or reformed adult as proof that the work mattered. It is understandable. Every institution needs support. But this pattern also meant that 5 Points residents often appeared in print at the moment of their worst exposure. The sick bed, the drunken fall, the filthy room, the neglected child, the desperate mother, the converted sinner. These were not full scenes, but they were selected scenes. A resident cooking carefully, saving money, sending a child to work, helping a neighbour, singing at a wake, or simply enduring another day was less useful to the fundraising story, unless it could be turned into either misery or improvement. The full human life between those categories was harder to print. Reporters worked in a related way. A good 5 Points article needed entry, danger, description, and return. The writer would often begin by reassuring the reader that he had gone where respectable people did not go. A guide might accompany him. A police officer might lead the way. He would describe the streets, the smells, the faces, the languages, the rooms, the women, the men, the children. He would linger over dirt because dirt proved distance. He would linger over bodies because bodies made poverty visible. He would tell the reader when he was disgusted, startled, saddened, amused, or frightened. Then he would emerge, back into the normal city, carrying the authority of someone who had seen. This structure made the neighbourhood feel like another country, even though it sat within walking distance of the city's institutions. That was one of the central tricks of 5 Points writing. It made poverty foreign. The residents might live in New York, work for New York, vote in New York, clean New York's clothes, dig New York's streets, carry New York's cargo, cook New York's meals, and serve New York's households. But in the literature of slumming, they became a separate population, a tribe, a class, a danger, a spectacle. Turning them foreign made it easier for readers to visit them imaginatively without recognizing them as neighbours. Slum tourism grew from that same impulse. Respectable men, and sometimes women under careful escort, could tour 5 Points to see the Forbidden City. They might visit a dance hall, a mission, a notorious lodging house, or a cellar. They might see enough stage disorder to feel the thrill and enough missionary order to feel moral seriousness. The tour allowed people to experience fear safely, which is one of the oldest pleasures of urban life. It also allowed them to feel charitable without surrendering superiority. A visitor could come away saying that the neighbourhood was worse than imagined, that the poor were degraded, that reform was necessary, and that he had been brave or compassionate enough to look. The residents, meanwhile, had been looked at again. There is a quiet violence in being repeatedly observed by people who can leave. The gaze itself becomes part of the environment. Children learn that strangers come to stare. Women learn that their rooms can become examples. Men learn that their anger confirms what outsiders already believe. Even kindness can feel like inspection when it arrives with a notebook. This does not mean reformers should not have entered. Some conditions needed witnesses. Without witnesses, many abuses remain comfortably invisible. But witnessing is never neutral when the witness has power and the subject has none. The question is always what the witness does with what he has seen. Does he return with a demand for structural change, or does he return with a story that makes himself feel enlarged? 5 Points received both kinds. The neighbourhood's legend hardened because the same elements appeared again and again. The old brewery, the mixed dance hall, the ragged child, the drunken Irishman, the black performer, the fallen woman, the cellar, the gang, the missionary, the police guide, the sudden fight, the smell. Over time, these elements became almost ritual. A person who had never visited could imagine the place, because the printed version had taught him what to expect. This is how a neighbourhood becomes a symbol. Repetition replaces complexity. The 5 points of print was not entirely imaginary, but it was simplified into a set of scenes that readers could recognise quickly. It became America's urban nightmare in shorthand. When people wanted to talk about the dangers of immigration, they invoked 5 points. When they wanted to talk about alcohol, 5 points. Catholic poverty, 5 points. Racial mixing, 5 points. Crime, 5 points. Political corruption, 5 points. Child neglect, 5 points. The neighbourhood became a container for every anxiety the expanding city produced. That container was useful precisely because it had a real address. You could point to it. You could walk there. You could claim the problem was located even when the forces behind it ran through the whole city. Police reports added another kind of authority. Crime recorded by the state looks more solid than rumour, and of course there was crime to record. But policing in 5 points was itself shaped by politics, prejudice, corruption, and the limits of 19th century law enforcement. Who was arrested, what was written down, which neighbourhoods were watched, which forms of violence counted, and whose complaints mattered were all shaped by power. A fight between poor men in the street became a public crime. A landlord's slow violence through neglect often did not. A woman arrested for prostitution entered the record. The men who profited from her vulnerability might not. A boy picked up for theft became evidence of juvenile depravity. The wages, hunger, housing, and adult exploitation behind his theft could remain outside the charge. Police records therefore tell us something important, but not everything. They show the moments when disorder became legible to authority. They do not show all the ordinary injuries authority had no interest in naming. Later in the century, Jacob Riis would bring a new tool to the long tradition of exposing New York poverty: photography. By the time Riis published How the Other Half Lives in 1890, the original 5 points had changed, and Mulberry Bend had become one of the great targets of reform. Riis was a police reporter, a Danish immigrant, and a man with a strong moral purpose. His photographs and writing showed middle-class readers tenement conditions with a force earlier prose could not always achieve. Flash photography entered dark rooms and made them visible to people who had never imagined the interiors clearly. Riis helped push housing reform, street cleaning, park creation, and the demolition of some of the worst areas. His work mattered. It also continued the complicated tradition of showing the poor to the comfortable. The camera could expose injustice, but it could also freeze people in the posture of their misery. A family photographed in a room becomes evidence. Evidence can bring reform, but it can also outlive the person as an image of degradation. 5 points and the districts around it were transformed not only by policies, but by this battle over visibility. The poor needed to be seen in order to be helped, but being seen often meant being reduced. There is no easy answer to that. It is one of the central tensions in the history of reform. If no one writes about the cellar remains. If someone writes about it badly, the people inside become caricatures. If someone photographs it, the image may move lawmakers, but it may also teach viewers to associate poverty with a permanent kind of otherness. 5 points was caught in that tension for decades. Its residents were ignored, then exposed, then judged, then assisted, then displaced, often by people who believed they were doing good. Some did good, some did harm. Many did both because cities rarely allow clean moral categories to survive contact with rent. By the end of the 19th century, the terrible legend had become larger than the neighbourhood itself. People remembered the worst corners even after they were gone. The name 5 points carried the weight of every lurid article, every mission report, every gang story, every drawing of the old brewery, every visitor's nervous description, every reform sermon, and later every popular history that preferred colourful violence to patient explanation. Herbert Asbury would eventually gather many of these stories in the 20th century and give them new life in The Gangs of New York, a book thrilling enough to influence modern imagination and unreliable enough that historians still have to untangle its claims, but Asbury did not create the appetite. He inherited it. The appetite began earlier when respectable people discovered that the poor neighbourhood below them could be consumed as warning, entertainment, moral lesson, and urban legend all at once. So when we think of 5 Points as America's most dangerous neighbourhood, we have to ask who made that phrase and why it lasted. The danger was real for the people who lived there. Disease was real, fire was real, violence was real, eviction was real, hunger was real, exploitation was real. But the legend of danger often served people outside the neighbourhood more than those inside it. It gave reformers a cause, reporters a subject, politicians a talking point, police a justification, and readers a thrill. It turned a place produced by New York's own growth into an object New York could condemn. That was the final cruelty. The city built the conditions, then published the horror, then congratulated itself for noticing. Still, inside the legend, there were people who used the attention to demand change. Mission workers raised money. Housing reformers gathered evidence. Journalists exposed conditions that should never have been tolerated. Rees and others helped force the city to admit that darkness inside tenements was not merely a private problem. The legend, for all its distortions, helped make reform politically possible. A false or exaggerated story can still push against a true injustice. That is why this history resists a simple verdict. The reporters exploited 5 Points and preserved it. The reformers judged residents and helped them. The visitors objectified poverty and made it harder for the city to deny. The legend damaged the people it described, but it also kept the neighbourhood from disappearing silently. As the 19th century moved on, the question shifted. If 5 Points was truly so dangerous, so shameful, so symbolic of everything wrong with the modern city, then what should New York do with it? Help it, police it, convert it, photograph it, demolish it, rename it, cover it with parks and courthouses, and let later pedestrians walk above the old stories without knowing where they stood. The city had already buried the pond, now it began preparing to bury the neighbourhood. By the time the old neighbourhood began to vanish, it had already been disappearing for years in smaller ways. That is how cities usually erase a place. Not all at once, not with one clean swing of a wrecking ball, not with a single official decision that says this is over now. They erase by renaming a street, closing an alley, replacing a building, changing who can afford a room, pushing one group out while another group arrives, declaring one block beyond repair and another ready for improvement, until the people who remember the older names start to sound like they are talking about a private dream. 5 Points did not disappear because the suffering ended. It disappeared because New York became ready to remove the parts of the neighbourhood that embarrassed it most visibly. The city had buried the pond. It had watched the poor live on the bad ground. It had allowed houses to rot, cellars to flood, and rooms to fill beyond decency. It had let reporters, reformers, tourists, police, and politicians turn the place into a terrible legend. Then, when the legend had become useful enough and shameful enough, New York began to take the neighbourhood apart. The first great symbolic removal had already happened in the 1850s, when the old brewery was demolished and the 5 Points mission rose in its place. That moment mattered because it taught reformers and donors that a notorious building could be turned into a public victory. You could point to the before and after. Before, a decaying former brewery packed with poor tenants, associated with violence, drunkenness, disease, and every kind of urban misery people were willing to imagine. After, a mission house, schoolrooms, prayer meetings, women and children receiving help, and donors able to believe that darkness had been met with light. The story was powerful, and in some individual lives the work was real. Children were educated there, women were offered work. Food, clothing, shelter, and religious instruction reached people who needed all or some of those things. but the demolition of one building did not change the structure of the city. The old brewery could come down, and still the rents remained. The damp remained. The low wages remained. The prejudice remained. The need for cheap rooms remained. When one terrible house vanished, the pressure that had filled it moved elsewhere. That is one reason urban reform can look impressive in a newspaper and feel smaller on the ground. The building is gone. The people are still poor. After the Civil War, 5 Points was no longer exactly the same neighbourhood that had horrified visitors in the 1840s and 1850s. Many Irish families had used it as a first step and moved on when they could. That should be remembered because it complicates the image of the district as a permanent trap. For some immigrants, it was temporary, brutal and useful. A place to land, learn the city, find work, join a parish, form connections, and then leave for a better street, another ward, Brooklyn, Jersey City, Hoboken, Queens, or somewhere farther. That movement was part of the American immigrant story, but it did not make the suffering of arrival disappear. The room that one family escaped became the room another family entered. By the 1870s and 1880s, more Italians were living in and around the old 5 Points area, especially around Mulberry Bend and nearby streets. Jewish residents, German families, remaining Irish households, black residents, and later Chinese residents were all part of the changing lower Manhattan world. The label 5 Points stayed heavy, but the population beneath it shifted. That is another thing cities do. They keep the old reputation and attach it to new people. The Italians who entered the district were often treated much the way earlier Irish immigrants had been treated, as poor, foreign, suspicious and difficult for respectable New York to understand. Many came from regions of Italy with strong local identities, not as one single Italian people in the way Americans often imagine them. They found work as labourers, street vendors, rag pickers, builders, fruit sellers, organ grinders, and in other hard occupations that required long hours and little security. Some men travelled seasonally for railroad or construction work and returned to lower Manhattan when the season ended. Families crowded into rooms that had already housed earlier waves of poverty. Women cooked, washed, saved, prayed, negotiated, and tried to make American streets less strange for children who learned English faster than their parents. Around them, grocery shops, churches, street markets, and mutual support networks grew. The old neighbourhood did not simply rot, it changed hands. It became a place where new immigrants inherited both the shelter and the stigma left by those before them. Chinese residents also became part of the area's later history as Chinatown expanded. Their presence reflected national and local forces far beyond 5 Points, exclusion laws, anti-Chinese violence in the West, labour displacement, migration, and the creation of urban enclaves where men and later families could find language, business connections, and some protection from hostility. Chinatown did not simply replace 5 Points like a clean page placed over an old one. It grew in the same lower Manhattan landscape of prejudice, cramped housing, small business, police suspicion, tourism, and survival. The surrounding city again turned an immigrant district into spectacle. Visitors who had once come to see 5 Points vice would later come to see Chinatown as exotic, secretive, dangerous, or picturesque, depending on the fashion of the moment. The names changed. The gaze remained familiar. By the late 19th century, the focus of reform had shifted toward Mulberry Bend, one of the most notorious pieces of the old district. The bend was named for the curve of Mulberry Street, an awkward turn shaped by the older landscape near the Collect Pond and the street pattern that had grown around it. It had alleys, rear tenements, hidden courts, cramped buildings, narrow passageways, and the kind of physical layout that made police complain and reformers despair. It was not only poor, it was difficult to see into and difficult to govern. That mattered. Authorities dislike spaces where people can disappear. Reformers dislike spaces where sunlight cannot easily be imagined. Landlords, however, could profit from them very well. A rear tenement might be invisible from the street, but it was not invisible to the rent collector. Families lived in places where air and light entered reluctantly, and children played in courts where the city's idea of childhood had clearly failed. Jacob Riis made Mulberry Bend famous in a new way. Earlier writers had described 5 points with words. Riis brought photographs, and photographs changed the moral temperature of reform. A written description could be dismissed as exaggeration. A photograph seemed to say, "Here it is, look." That trust in the camera was not always deserved, because every photograph has a frame, a purpose, and a person behind it. But the force was undeniable. Riis photographed alleys, rooms, children, lodging houses, and street scenes, with the harsh illumination of flash powder. He was not a neutral observer. He had judgments, prejudices, favourites, blind spots, and a strong belief in the moral power of exposure. He could be demeaning toward the people he wanted to help. He could also be relentless in forcing comfortable New Yorkers to look at conditions they preferred not to see. Both things are true. His work around Mulberry Bend helped convince the city that some blocks were not merely poor but physically dangerous to the public future. The solution he pushed was not just policing or preaching. It was demolition and open space. Think about what that meant for the people living there. To reformers, demolition could mean air, light, grass, safety, and a break in the cycle of crime and disease. To residents, it could mean all of that in theory, but it also meant being displaced. If your building was torn down, where did you go? If your rent was low because the room was terrible, a better housing market did not suddenly appear because reform had declared the old one immoral. Many residents moved into other overcrowded streets. Some found better quarters. Some were pushed deeper into the city's housing crisis. This is the complication at the heart of slum clearance. A bad building may need to come down, but a family still needs a bed that night. Reform often celebrated the absence of old filth, without following the displaced poor closely enough to ask whether their lives had improved or merely moved. In 1895, under Mayor William L. Strong's administration, the city began the process of clearing Mulberry Bend. Buildings came down. The crooked little world of rear houses, alleys, and hidden rooms was open to the sky. The act was presented as progress, and in a very real sense it was. No honest account of 5 Points should pretend that those tenements were worth preserving as housing. They were not. They were unhealthy, overcrowded, dangerous, and often predatory. Children needed space to breathe and play. Families needed sunlight. The city needed to admit that housing was not a private matter when private neglect killed people. But progress in cities often arrives carrying a second blade. It cuts away what is harmful, and it also cuts through memory, community, and the fragile arrangements by which poor people survive. A dark alley might be dangerous, but it might also be where a woman knew which neighbour would help her. A rear tenement might be unfit, but it might be close to work, church, school, credit, language, and kin. When reform tore down the bend, it removed a disgrace. It also scattered a world. Mulberry Bend Park opened in 1897. It was later called 5 Points Park, then Paradise Park, and eventually Columbus Park. The names themselves tell a small history of forgetting. Mulberry Bend named the problem directly, tying the park to the notorious curve. 5 Points Park kept the old legend attached but softened it into public improvement. Paradise Park sounded almost like a joke if you knew what had been there before, though perhaps that was the point. Columbus Park, renamed in 1911, connected the space to Italian-American identity and the surrounding community at a time when the neighbourhood had changed again. Each name covered and revealed something. The land had once been near a pond, then a slum, then a reform project, then an immigrant gathering place. Now, on many days, it is a Chinatown park where older people sit, talk, play cards or chess, practice Tai Chi, listen to music, watch children, and use public space the way city residents always have, as an extension of homes too small to contain a full life. The park did not erase the need for public gathering. It simply changed the terms of it. It is worth pausing over that image. Where once reformers saw dark hovels and hidden crime, there is now open space, benches, trees, paths, people passing through on lunch breaks, grandparents watching children, musicians, conversation. The sounds are different from the old 5 points, but not as different as we might think. Public life remains public life. People still use the park because apartments are small, because streets are busy, because city life needs shared rooms under the sky. The old neighbourhood's danger came partly from the absence of healthy public space. The park answered that absence. It did not solve poverty, but it gave the area something the tenements had stolen: air that did not have to be rented. Around the same broader area, civic New York expanded. Courthouses, government buildings, police facilities, and municipal structures increasingly occupied land tied to the old Collect Pond and 5 Points. Foley Square sits over ground that once belonged to that watery landscape. The Tombs, New York's infamous jail, had earlier risen near the filled pond, its own grim answer to bad ground and social disorder. Later public buildings gave the area a different face: official, stone, monumental, bureaucratic. The transformation is almost too neat. A neighbourhood associated with crime, poverty, and immigrant disorder was gradually overwritten by buildings of law, judgment, administration, and state power. Courts where people are tried, offices where records are kept, streets where clerks, lawyers, defendants, police officers, and city workers move through the day. The poor neighbourhood did not vanish into nothing, it vanished beneath authority. That authority also changed the map. Streets were renamed, extended, closed, and altered. Orange Street became Baxter, Anthony became Worth, Cross became Park for a time. Little Water Street disappeared. Paradise Square vanished. The physical intersection that gave 5 Points its name no longer works the way it once did. A person can stand near the old site today and feel uncertain, because the old geometry has been broken. That uncertainty is part of the erasure. The name 5 Points depended on a meeting of streets. Change the streets, and the name loses its anchor. The city did not need to banish the memory directly. It only had to make the place harder to locate. Once a neighbourhood becomes difficult to point to, it becomes easier to turn it into legend instead of history. And yet the past kept surfacing, sometimes literally. In the late 20th century, archaeology in the area uncovered evidence from the old 5 Points neighbourhood. Household objects, bottles, ceramics, food remains, pipes, buttons, toys, and the everyday material traces of people whom newspapers had treated as types. This is one of the most important recoveries in the whole story, because archaeology does something reform writing rarely does. It slows the eye down. A sensational account might say, degraded poor. A broken plate says someone served food. A toy says a child played. A pipe says someone took a small pleasure. A decorated cup says someone cared about appearance, ritual, or respectability. Bones from meals say what people ate, not what outsiders imagined they ate. Artifacts do not make poverty gentle, but they make the poor specific. They remind us that the people of 5 Points were not only residents of a slum. They were consumers, workers, parents, children, believers, drinkers, dancers, mourners, neighbours, and owners of small things. A button lost in the mud can correct a century of insult more quietly than any speech. This is what New York tried to forget, or perhaps what it found easier not to remember. The city remembered the gangs because gangs make vivid stories. It remembered the old brewery because one terrible building gives the imagination a place to stand. It remembered Reese because reformers with cameras fit neatly into the story of progress. It remembered the park because parks are proof that the city can improve itself. but it was less eager to remember the sequence of responsibility. The pond was polluted before the slum was blamed. The ground was filled badly before poor families rented there. Landlords profited before reformers mourned. Immigrants were needed before they were condemned. Black residents were pushed aside in memory after helping shape the neighbourhood's life. Women's labour held rooms together before any mission report described them. Children survived in streets that adults had made unsafe. The city did not simply rescue 5 points from itself. It rescued a piece of land from conditions the city had helped create. There is also something else New York tried to forget. The pattern repeated. 5 points vanished, but overcrowding did not. Bad housing did not. Immigrant suspicion did not. The habit of treating poor neighbourhoods as both labour reservoirs and moral failures did not. As Lower Manhattan changed, other districts carried the burden of being named the dangerous place. Hell's Kitchen, the Lower East Side, Tenderloin districts, later neighbourhoods in other boroughs. Every generation of the city seems to choose a place where it imagines danger lives naturally, then discovers, slowly and with great reluctance, that danger follows neglect, exclusion, and profit. 5 Points was not an exception in American urban history. It was an early lesson that the country kept refusing to learn. Walk through the area now, and the old fear is difficult to feel unless you know where to look. Modern Chinatown is crowded, busy, alive with shops, restaurants, markets, signs, deliveries, tourists, residents, workers, and languages moving quickly through the air. The Civic Centre gives another kind of atmosphere, formal and heavy with law. Columbus Park feels like a place people use rather than a place people merely pass. Children play where reformers once imagined children being saved by sunlight. Older people gather where old alleys once made police uneasy. Lawyers hurry near ground that once held cellars. A visitor might eat lunch nearby without knowing that beneath the ordinary movements of the day are layers of water, mud, poverty, riot, dance, prayer, reform, and demolition. That ignorance is not a personal failure. Cities are built to make the past hard to see. Pavement is very good at silence. But if you stand still long enough, the silence is not complete. The street names carry fragments. Baxter, Worth, Mulberry, Park, Canal, reminding us of the attempt to drain the pond away. The courthouse district reminds us that public power came to occupy the land. Columbus Park reminds us that open air was once considered a radical cure for dark housing. Chinatown reminds us that immigrant New York did not stop with the Irish or Italians, but kept remaking itself through new arrivals, new exclusions, new communities, and new forms of resilience. Even the absence of the old 5 Points intersection says something. The missing shape is part of the story. A place does not need to survive intact in order to leave evidence. Sometimes the evidence is the difficulty of finding it. So what became of America's most dangerous neighbourhood? The simplest answer is that it was demolished, renamed, redeveloped, absorbed into Chinatown and the Civic Centre, and buried under parks, courts, streets, and memory. But the better answer is slower. 5 Points became a warning, then a spectacle, then a reform cause, then a construction site, then a historical reference, then a movie image, then an archaeological recovery, then a question people still ask because the phrase remains powerful. How did a neighbourhood become so dangerous? The answer is not that bad people gathered in one unlucky place. The answer is that a city made a bad place, rented it to people with few choices, judged them for living there, profited from their labour and their notoriety, and then erased the visible evidence when the shame became too large to manage. That does not mean the residents were saints. They were human. Some were kind and some were violent. Some worked honestly and some stole. Some protected neighbours and some preyed on them. Some drank themselves into ruin and some saved enough to leave. Some exploited the weak and some were weak enough to be exploited. The point is not to purify them. The point is to restore the conditions around them so the story makes sense. 5 Points was dangerous because human beings under pressure can become dangerous, and because institutions that should relieve pressure often increase it instead. Land, housing, wages, policing, politics, prejudice, disease, drink, and journalism all met there. The result was not a simple den of vice. It was a neighbourhood where America's urban future arrived early and badly. Near the end, the city chose light and air as its answer. There is something moving in that, despite everything. After decades of dark rooms, rear tenements, crowded alleys, and children with no place to play but the street, reformers fought for open space. Trees and benches may sound modest after so much misery, but they were not modest to people who had lived without them. A park is not a revolution by itself, but it can mark a change in what a city admits people need. Not just work, not just discipline, not just police, space, sunlight, air. A place where a child can move without stepping over a drunk man or a puddle of waste. A place where an old person can sit without paying rent for the seat. A place where the public life of the poor is not automatically treated as disorder. That was the best version of the reform impulse, and it should be acknowledged. Still, the park also covered the evidence. Grass can be a mercy, and it can be a lid. New York has always lived with that double meaning. It creates beauty over trouble. It lays out paths over vanished rooms. It plants trees where people once slept badly. It builds courthouses over a pond it polluted and filled. It names things after explorers, officials, reformers, and ideals, while the names of washerwomen, labourers, peddlers, dancers, children, and boarders disappear unless archaeology or a census page catches them by accident. That is why remembering 5 Points requires more than repeating gang names. It requires looking at the park, the courts, the streets, and the crowds of today, and understanding that nothing in a city is only what it appears to be. The old neighbourhood is gone, and it is not gone. It is gone in the sense that you cannot walk into the old brewery, cannot stand in Paradise Square as it was, cannot follow the exact old angles of the 5 streets, cannot hear the same mix of 1850s voices rising from the saloons, cannot smell the same damp cellars or see the same children running through the mud. It is not gone because the questions it raises are still here. Who gets pushed onto bad land? Who profits from poor housing? Who is described as dangerous before anyone asks what danger they have been made to live with? Who gets photographed, policed, pitied, or cleared away? Who gets remembered as a builder of the city, and who is remembered only as a problem the city solved? That is the final thing 5 Points leaves us with. Not a neat moral, but a way of looking. The most dangerous neighbourhood in America did not begin as a nightmare. It began as water, then waste, then land, then housing, then crowding, then story, then reform, then erasure. Each stage made the next easier to misunderstand. If you see only the gangs, you miss the rooms. If you see only the rooms, you miss the land. If you see only the land, you miss the people. If you see only the people, you miss the city that shaped their choices. 5 Points asks us to hold all of it at once. The mud and the music, the violence and the labour, the reform and the spectacle, the park and the buried pond, the old danger and the new city walking over it without slowing down. And tonight, somewhere under the ordinary streets of Lower Manhattan, the story still sits in layers. The pond beneath the pavement, the tenement beneath the courthouse, the dance floor beneath the park path, the child's toy beneath the official map. The name 5 Points may no longer organise the neighbourhood the way it once did, but it still points in 5 directions at once. Toward poverty, toward power, toward fear, toward survival, and toward the uncomfortable fact that cities remember even when people try not to. The next time you see a crowded street, a renamed block, a park in the middle of old tenement ground, or a neighbourhood described too easily as dangerous, it is worth pausing before accepting the label. There may be a pond beneath it. There may be a landlord behind it. There may be a reporter's sentence still clinging to it. and there are almost certainly people inside it, building a world from what the city has left them,